สวัสดีอีกรอบหนึ่งนะครับเป็นยังไงบ้างครับอาหารเที่ยงผมก็ยังติดใจกับเพลงเปิดตัวทุกครั้งนะครับรอบบ่ายโทษงั้นผมไปซื้อเสื้อมา700โอเคเนาะรอบบ่ายนะครับเรายังมีกันอีก3ท่านนะครับซึ่งอย่างที่บอกเมื่อตอนก่อนพักเที่ยงว่าเราเก็บตัวจี๊ดๆไว้ท้ายจริงๆแล้วพรุ่งนี้มีอีกวันหนึ่งที่จุฬานะครับตรงคณะคอมดีเข้าประตูฝั่งอุเทนนะครับเดี๋ยวที่เราจะได้เจอกันคนแรกนะครับคนที่ผมชอบมากคุณอนุทินนะครับหลายท่านคงรู้จักกันดีนะฮะเป็นไทโปกราฟเฟอร์ชาวไทยน่าจะเป็นคนแรกๆนะฮะแล้วต่อด้วยนะครับคุณโรเบิร์ตบิงเฮิร์สครับเป็นนักเขียนนักกวีและนักออกแบบนะครับจากนั้นก็คุณแกรี่ซึ่งเขาจะมาพูดเรื่องตัวพิมพ์ต่างๆนะครับและเย็นลงไปอีกคือคุณลาแฮมเซนนะครับเป็นดีไซเนอร์จากแมกมานะครับส่วนสุดท้ายไม่ใช่สุดท้ายมีแค่นี้แหละฮะในนี้เขาเขียนว่าบริสจะปิดท้ายจริงๆเราต้องขอบคุณทุกท่านนะครับขออนุญาตขอบคุณแทนทีมงานนะครับที่ทุกท่านมาในวันนี้นะครับเพราะว่าจริงๆเราจะว่าไปไทโปกราฟีหรืออะไรเนี่ยมันก็ถือว่าเป็นสิ่งใหม่สำหรับสังคมเราเหมือนกันเอาจริงๆอย่างผมลืมแนะนำตัวเพิ่งนึกขึ้นได้เมื่อตอนกินข้าวว่าลืมแนะนำตัวเสียมารยาทมากเลยชื่อโน้ตนะครับเป็นกราฟิกดีไซเนอร์นะครับจากบริษัทสโลโมชั่นนะฮะคือทางผู้จัดเขาก็อยากจะบอกว่าเขาคิดว่าน่าจะเอาพิธีกรน่าจะเอาคนที่แบบว่าทำงานออกแบบจะได้แบบรู้เรื่องรู้ราวหน่อยก็คิดผิดไปแล้วคือจริงๆแล้วงานนี้จากถ้าเกิดเราเห็นโดยรวมแล้วคือจะทราบน่าจะรู้สึกกันได้ว่าจัดด้วยแพชชั่นนะฮะคือเพื่อศิลปะแขนงนี้โดยเฉพาะเงินทองคงไม่ได้เยอะหรอกก็ดูชื่อสปอนเซอร์มีใครให้เงินบ้างล่ะนะครับก็ถ้าเขามีเงินคงไม่จ้างเราคงไปจ้างชมพู่จ้างแพนเค้กจ้างดาราเกรดบีมาแทนนะฮะก็ต้องขอบคุณที่ทุกท่านมาร่วมในวันนี้เรายังมีวันหนึ่งพรุ่งนี้นะครับที่จุฬาไม่รู้เพราะอะไรตอนบ่ายผมพูดจาได้คล่องขึ้นนะฮะสงสัยว่าเช้าจะหิวข้าวนะครับพูดถึงสปอนเซอร์ก็ขอบคุณอีกรอบนึงนะครับTCDC นะครับPrincess มหาอันนี้คือศูนย์มนุษยวิทยาศิรินธรนะครับสถาบันเกอเต้นะฮะUniversity of Reading UK นะครับจุฬาลงกรณ์มหาวิทยาลัย Ministry of Culture of the Republic of Armenia มันอยู่ตรงไหนใช่ประเทศนาเนียหรือเปล่าฮะ Bangkok University นะครับไทก้าหรือ Thai Graphic Design Association นะครับมหาวิทยาลัยศิลปากร Brown Sugar เมื่อวานดีมากใครไม่ไปเสียดายแทนด้วยได้ดูดีสเตฟานด้วยแล้วก็ Typographisch Galeries München นะฮะเดี๋ยวก่อนนะครับแป๊บหนึ่งขอต้อนรับแขกผู้มีเกียรติทุกท่านกับสู่การชันคอนเฟอเรนซ์2013ในช่วงบ่ายครับหลังจากที่ทุกท่านได้มีความสุขกับการรับประทานอาหารกลางวันที่เรียบร้อยแล้วผมขอเชิญทุกท่านเข้าสู่ประชุมบ่ายที่มีความน่าสนใจไม่แพ้ช่วงเช้าหรือช่วงเช้าโอเคเขาให้ย้ำนะครับว่าอย่าลืมนะครับว่าทุกครั้งที่มีวิทยากรขึ้นถ้าเกิดใครมีข้อสงสัยอยากถามตอนจบช่วง Q&A นะครับก็รบกวนจดใส่กระดาษแล้วเดี๋ยวจะมีเจ้าหน้าที่ของเราไปรับนะครับหรือว่าใครอยากจะพูดออกไมค์ก็ให้ยกมือนะครับซึ่งตอนนั้นจะบอกอีกทีหนึ่งต้องพูดภาษาอังกฤษไหมฮะโยนเข้าช่วงเลยนะครับก่อนที่คุณอนุทินจะขึ้นมาขอเชิญมิสเตอร์ลาร์ right where are you Boris you have to come up คุณบอริสครับเอาตบมือช่วงบ่ายทีนะครับ
I see you're awake now not so sleepy like today in morning
เมื่อเช้าเรียกกอง7 โมงแบบโอ้โหเพื่อ
I hope you have not the classical problem after lunch and you are now in lunch coma I will try it with a small question there is a little country far away it's called Armenia Is there anybody who knows where it is? Hands up. Oh, yes, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Okay. I think when you are stay here today and you come tomorrow to the symposium, you will after this know where Armenia is, but you have to attend. Okay. Um, I have it's my pleasure to introduce now Anuthin because it's necessary. It's not It's not possible. Not. It's nobody need to know who is Anuthin because everybody know it here. And so it's a wonderful possibility for me to say thank you to Anuthin because he is one of the men who is make this here possible because he have done this wonderful small conference in 2010 called BITS Bangkok International Typography Symposium, and I was deeply impressed about the idea, the concept, and the quality of this conference as I stayed in 2010 here. And in these discussions, we agreed that it could be a good possibility to make a conference specialized on the theme of non-Latin typefaces. And so it's absolutely clear that he is now one of the speakers here at the podium. Please, Anuthin, come on stage.
Thank you. Whoa. Not many occasions that you will see your face that big on the screen. Yep, and of course the name that big on the screen. Anuthin Wongsunkakong, most of people in this room probably know me by that name. Yes, let's begin. Okay, before I get into my very topic today, I'm just gonna give you a little introduction to Thai script. I call it Thai script 101. Basically, this is how it's work. Okay, so you got of course you got the consonants. You got 44 of them. Plenty to construct words and stuff, and of course you got vowels. A bunch of it. This is not all of it because we actually have like about 32 of them. So I just list the most common one. And of course the mark. Some of you may think, why do I have garan, which is the last one? How can I use the pointer? Right there as a mark because you only know ek to tri jatawa, which is 4 levels of tone marks. But the last one is to kill the sound when you put it on top of that particular words or letters. Okay, so then you have another form of Thai. Of course, the one before it's a loopless terminal. And this one is called, we call it loop terminal. I come to this term by an accident working with linotype a few years back on Helvetica Thai. And then we start working on more project on the Thai version of Frutiger. And we plan for both version, the loop and loopless. And doing our communication is so confusing because you need some term to describe or as an official name of this little circle. Sometimes we call it little circle, little dot, or whatever. So we both party agree on loop and loopless, which is quite a good term for this. So when these letters kind of like form, you got some small word here. This say every time, and then as you can see here in this landscape, you have of course pretty much like Latin. You have x height, but in Thai we call ความสูงของบอใบไม้ which is the height of one of the character called บอใบไม้ And then you have a descender, which is something that below that the baseline, and then you have the second level, and then you have the third level to accommodate the vowel and tone mark. And of course, these little words form a string of text. So this is how it's worked. You got everything in that combo. So you got some tone mark within the in front of consonants, and then you got something in between. There's a lot of things going on. And then, of course, you put a string of text together, then you get a block of text. So this is the texture that you come across every single day here in this country. Okay, so the next stop, I'm going to talk about books on Thai type designs, which is these 3 books. They are very significant, and I'm pretty sure that most of you here who are type lover, who are Thai and type lover, you probably know these 3 books by heart. And for those of you who are in school and about to do a research or any kind of project about type, I think we really desperately need more books about type and typography here, because otherwise it would be just this very short list here. The first one is the one that called To Akson Thai, which is of course it's endorsed by the Royal Academy. So it's something that you lean on, fall back on. So this is what the traditional look like. It's odd enough that when you think of Thai letter, you tend to think of Gaugai. First. It's just like letter A in Latin, okay? So, but it's odd enough, when you think of this, Gaugai is the only character in the whole set of Thai script that has no loop. So, but all the time you try to define what Thai typeface look like. Oh, there's a loop terminal. But, the picture in your head come up like Gaugai without loop terminal. It's really weird. Anyway, this book is really great. It's a good start, but the rule is so strict. I'm not saying this is a bad book, don't get me wrong. It's a wonderful book for you to start, but the rule is so strict, and if you follow every single rule in this book, you're probably going to end up with the same typeface. The next one is a book, everybody call it Mai Kwan Sia, which is I still couldn't figure out why we have that image on the cover, which doesn't relate it to the subject that much. It was done by NECTEC, which is the short for National Electronic and Computer Technology Center. So the name of the name say it all. That's why it was made, because it's information and the look of this subject from the software side point of view. So it's another wonderful book because it was right there at the fence between, at the transition between transition from the ASCII typeface to OpenType. So it's a useful book, but leave alone the back specimens. The back specimen is a disaster, so don't go by that, please. The last one is so wonderful, and everybody probably know this because some of you, I'm pretty sure if you've been around long enough, then you probably get to see this wonderful exhibition by Kun Pacha Suviranont. Really great exhibition, and also the issue of Sarakadi magazines about 10 typeface, 10 significant typeface in Thailand, based on the economic point of view, and from political point of view, and so many things. So it's a good start for any type designer to understand the timeline, and of course it's also a road that paved the way to for us to categorize and classify Thai typeface in the future, which is we still lack of that. So you guys just have to give a little help and give a little push to make it happen. So today I'm going to talk about the things that these 3 books don't tell you. As you see, I have it listed in like all kind of languages. The top one is Armenian, of course. Thanks to Rand. Thank you. I have no idea because I can only read Thai and English, of course, and the rest would be, all, as far as I'm concerned, is could say, don't believe this guy doesn't know anything. I don't know. Anyway, okay, 10 of them. Let's start with the number one, the proportion. Of course, the Thai versus Latin, and the proportion of the old Thai and the new Thai. So let's see. What you see here is a UPCC, which is the faithful revision of the famous Tom Light by Thongtham Samarasut, which is probably one of a really good example from for the typesettings days. You see that Latin listed at 200 point. Of course, up there is not 200 point. Thai at 200 point. You see that Thai is relatively small compared to the X height. And of course, if you want something that really go together with Latin, you almost have to bump it up 95 point to make it more believable. Otherwise, you would have to go back and then try to select some text and then bump it up yourself. It is a bitch when you are doing typesettings. So problem solved with Thongtham, which is our version of Tom Light, and we name it Thongtham just to honor Mr. Thongtham Samarasut, who's the original designer of this typeface. In the big picture, you see that the ความสูง of the บอใบไม้ the height of บอใบไม้ is right about in the middle of X height and the cap height. So that's the new proportion that we're looking for. Because in the old day, if you go by the first book, they tend to want Thai to be kind of smaller than Latin. And like I said, what happened is you have to reselect and then bump up the text. Or the old practice that type designer used to do back then is they would just steal the Latin, the whole Latin one table, and then press copy and paste it, and then shrink it down to meet Thai, which is I think it's not a good practice at all. Talking in terms of today context, that is no, should not be done. So that's how it's worked together in the height. And the next stop is I'm going to talk about the texture. The texture, the breeze within the text string, and the value of the spacebar. What the hell is this? Yes, you got Helvetica, and of course when you use it, when you use English, you tap spacebar after word. When you finish one word, then you tap spacebar, and then you go on to another word. The same thing doesn't apply for Thai because we only tap the spacebar at the end of sentence. So what happened is it's look much clustered together. In order to mimic the same quality in when you list it side by side, you just have to add more air into the text string itself. But adding more air to the text string, you cannot exceed the value of the spacebar because otherwise the spacebar will be meaningless in this context. So you add more of left and right side bearing, but do not exceed the scale of spacebar. So this is what it looks like when we look at it in terms of just graphic form. So you see how clustered it is, like that. All right. The next stop is this one is really hard for me to explain, but you just have to kind of relate it to your experience in Thailand. Of course, if you are native Thai, then you understand exactly what I mean. But for a foreigner, you would have to kind of bear with me a little bit. So the ideal representation of in the sea of change, out there we have, like I told you, we have loop and loopless terminal, and the ideal, the picture when we say, hey, loop terminal is very original, and this is the what the Thai typeface should look like. Here it is. This is what's in your mind. You may think of like Angsana, New, or something in that category, which is we call it ฝรั่งเศส. Have you ever wondered what the word ฝรั่งเศสmean? Anybody in here know what the word ฝรั่งเศสfrom? Yes, that's how we Thai call any white guy, Caucasian, really. It doesn't, regardless of where you come from, we call you ฝรั่ง. So another word, we call you French, which is kind of weird. Anyway, this ฝรั่งเศส style of typeface in this category is a like idealistic picture of what Thai typeface should look like. You can see here there's a resembling of old style Latin typeface. Let's say Galamon, because this was done by a French missionary back then. So this is the interpretation of old style Latin typeface when it's applied to Thai. It's already been Latinized then. So what is really the true identity here? Just a question, no answer need. And then you might familiar with Thonburi, but of course you guys use cell phone, iPhone, you use Mac. Thonburi is a default font, so you're familiar with this face already. Of course, it's a loop terminal, and then you have the loopless terminal, and this is a Sukhumvit, which is one of the flagship product at Katsanima, at my office, that we revised it many times over. And this is a bunch of slides that will give you an overview on the good mix of reality. You have loop and loopless working side by side in the real world. So the absolute ideal of Thai have only loop terminal just doesn't match with the reality. And the last one is very funny. Can you see what is so funny? No? Oh, it's really hard to explain for foreigner, but I'll try my best here. This is a screen capture from เรื่องเล่าเช้านี้ which is a morning news shows, and they do this little scoop. Well, it's on, of course, the channel 3 up there, public TV. They do this little report about, I have to read this. The most common mistake Thai character in handwriting. That's what it is up there. And well, of course, that's wrong, and that's wrong. It's just so stupid. But you know what is right and what is wrong anyway. You know, as long as you can read it. So anyway, the loop terminal and loopless terminal, it's not a straightforward process like most people may think. If you come to think of it, loopless terminal, here is บอใบไม้ again. You have loop terminal there, and of course the bottom is square. But it makes more sense to have a loopless terminal look like that with round shaped bottom. Here's why. Okay, if you take the loop out, then you get this form right here. See, you got Thai in this auditorium probably think, no, that doesn't look like บอใบไม้. Well, it was บอใบไม้ a minute ago before we take this off. Then you add this curve here, the round back stem, the bottom part, and then try to keep this straight, just like this one. It still doesn't work. Well, it works sometimes. It depends on the context or where it's land in the word construction or in a sentence. But it makes more sense to read out as bobemai when you have the shape like letter U, which is really bizarre. I know it's really hard to cope with that, but bear with me. So that's wrong. And that's the middle one seems to be okay. And the last one is it definitely bobemai for loopless. Number 4 is structure alteration. What's look like? What's look alike? It's not identical. This is pretty much same as Latin typeface, because you know when you look at form with the naked eyes, you probably think, oh, letter m, lowercase m is just like you just double, you want to make m out of n, then you just double it up. It doesn't work that way. Well, we all know that, right? Same thing. Gokai is well the most popular one, of course, because you get all these friends of Gokai, a relative. I put it, relative would be a better word. There's a whole pack of relative. So you got something in common there, which is a little which a little thing, little different, and then you got combo of this and combo of that. What defines Gokai is the beak. Well, gai is actually chicken. Chicken in Thai. So that's why I use the word beak. This looks pretty much like a bird beak. So and this is also what make or what can you turn Gokai into something else is it's gonna associate with this part of the letter. Okay, let's move on. Here's a problem. I have seen so many good designs in the past few years, and some of the new type designer in Thailand try to simplify, make it everything so nice and neat, but sometimes just went a little overboard. What happened here? If you take the beak out of Gokai, by itself, okay, as a display face, it's look passable as Gokai. And then you have Tatung using the same structure, and you have this loop terminal representative of loop terminal there. Doesn't look right. See, the one that got highlighted. And what is it? Is it dodek or tatung? So it's kind of confused. And you will see it right away that what is it? Is duk or tuk? And this is tuk, but how come Gokai doesn't match with tatung? So you almost have to go with that, the last one. And the next one is, of course, is sort of like look alike, but it's not identical. So nonen is another good example. This look like a combo of tatung and nonu. It should be a straightforward like that, should it? No, because when you really do it, you have to do a lot of adjustment. And for those of you who's not a type designer, you probably cannot imagine like how hard it is to fit everything together. It's not a straightforward process, but procedure. But for those of you who design type every day, you know what I mean, exactly what I mean. So the fifth one is more family member with proper design objective. What is it? Okay, I'll let you go through this slide first. So you see all this headline and then subhead, and then you see like different typefaces using in the same newspaper. This practice is still very common today. I talked to Ben the other day about how bold and flavor of Thai newspaper, and you probably agree with me, right? There's like so many stuff going on, all different kind of typefaces, and it's just sometimes I think it's just like Thai food, so bold in flavor. Everything has to be like really, really bang, 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 boom. So you got so many typeface. Thai designer like graphic designer like to use a lot of typeface as much as they can. So Adobe be aware of that. Anyway, so but they have this fixed idea about the text has to be only in loop terminal, and anything else other than text could be anything. Okay, so and another question that I have, and I will answer this all together, is the lack of weight. Like the family of loop terminal is relatively small, so you either have light and regular or regular and bold. This idea of family already been around for quite some time, but it's never take on until photographer actually come into play. And of course, at the early day of photographer, most of Thai type designers would just use the bold function, and they try to make a bold version instantly out of the program. The first one is Tong Term, the one I mentioned before. The second one, you see, it's read out as monotype. Why is monotype? I'm about 40. So Farang said, the one that you see before, probably an idealistic, the ideal picture of what Thai loop terminal should look like for someone older than me. But for my generation down, who's we more familiar with monotype typeface here, which is commissioned by Tawapor Thai Vattana Panit here, and they made an order of monotype machine from the UK. So of course it has to come with type. It has to come with a set of typeface. And then we all grow up with Mani Manapiti Chujai again, and all these school books that printed in this typeface. That's why our generation seems to have a different picture. It's not thick and thin. We're talking about monoline here. And of course, the old friend Farang said. But the problem is, if you want to make it bolder than bold, well, actually, is it possible? Yes, it is possible, but the problem that you're going to run into is this loop going to close up on you. So actually, this look much better than the screen, though. Is it black? No. I think you can make it even darker, but then you're going to run into more problem. And another problem is when you push it up to, let's say, black weight. Look at this diagram. You got this stuff all over. In short, you will see that everything kind of like slide to the cute side. Just look cute. It's just look too cute, and this loop terminal even add more cuteness to the design itself. So you end up with a different typeface altogether because it's just the concept just kind of like turn into something else. I think the same problem also applied to Latin typeface as well. If you push it up too fat, then it has more chance of being cute, but somehow you have to kind of maintain the original concept of the typeface. And this is what we are doing at our office. It's a new font that we got DMARC award and got nominated for a Prime Minister award. And we're still working on it. We submit some of the weight, and we plan for a much bigger variety of weight. And it's going to be really, really awesome when we release it in the next couple months. As you see, the heavyweight, we try to save this feature and don't make it look so tiny, and you have to plan ahead if you're gonna how many weights you're gonna have. So you have to plan ahead that you have to have big loop terminal, so it's have more space when it's close up a little bit each weight down. So. Well, by the way, thanks to our team at Katzen Denmark. They did such a wonderful job, and I really enjoy working with every one of them every day. Number 6 is inspiration found in the Renaissance of type design. What is Renaissance of type design? Have you ever have Renaissance? Okay. In plain text, it's a golden age, and for me, it's the 70s is 70 and late up to late 70s is a really good spot for inspiration. I mean, if you have time machine, you go back and you're gonna meet this guy coming up in a little while. This is the stuff. Oh, by the way. Okay, that's Ratchadamnern street signs, and it was, of course, that typeface was designed by this guy. His name is Manop Sisampon, which we all know as Ajahn Manop. This is a current picture of him. There's a lot to talk about this guy, and this morning, Garrett talked about the commission job for like, let's say, road sign or thing like that. But listen to this. The street sign that we use, or all the traffic signs on the expressway, is a reproduction of this guy typeface that he designed for dry transfer. So he actually got no money at all, not even penny. And it's got repeated for everybody to use it every day. And not just that, the Department of Transportation took away the little dot because they don't want to have too many dots on the sign, because that's why we end up with the sign without the inside part of the loop terminal. So thanks to this guy, we all have this typeface for free, sort of. And if you go, and again, if you can hop in a time machine and then get some stuff from that 70s or late 70s, there's a rich period for you to dig up all the stuff. And also, it's a very first day. It's a very first daylight for type designer, because we actually officially had type foundries, and also type foundry does employ the actual type designers working for Mekonomer. So, why dry transfer is so famous back then? Of course, because of putting your typeface into a phototype setting system is quite expensive. So most people would just go get a text print out from phototype settings, and then you wrap all these fancy typefaces by yourself in the artwork. And that's also, by doing that, it's also contribute to the fact that we have all these fancy typefaces using as a display, and then you have this more like a common one for the text. And I want to add a little story here about Mr. Manop. It's a really sad report. I just have to. I can't really skip this. I am sad to report to you all that the last batch of his own archive, all the stuff that he has done, you can see in Art4D. It's we did a special issue on him a few years back, and of course you can check on my own web blog, Anuthin.org. And you don't really need to have Google Translate because we have an English version for that. And you will learn good stuff about this guy. Anyway, the last batch of the stuff that he keep for himself, all the sketches and all the dry transfer and all kind of stuff got flushed away during the 2011. Was that 11? Yes, the national disaster. So everything's already gone. Sorry to say. And if some of you still have this original dry transfer of Panoptica, which is the most famous designs from Ajahn Manop, so contact me, please. Okay, so the next thing is the stop number 7 is size does matter. What is it? I know what you're thinking. Size does matter. I kind of sick of this old say that many people say to me that, oh, loop terminal actually promote you to read, and well, not that, and people mistaken me from defending that. That is not true. People mistaking me and think that I'm a big fan of loopless terminal, but actually it's not at all. I just want to point out in this chapter of my presentation that the loop terminal does not really promote the legibility like you think. It may at up to a certain degree. You know why? Because all of you, when you do the text, you do typesetting in text, you probably never go down smaller than 12. Most of the time you probably end up with 14 point size. And we all grew up seeing loop terminal at 14 point size all the time. Is relatively huge. So this, what you see is the text setting in 14 point size. It's not about loop terminal or loopless terminal. It's about the size. And of course, this new device also come to play. What happened here is you see that loop terminal and loopless terminal serving in the same, well, let's say area. But this is what happened when you have clipping area. Then you got some part like in your iPhone. Of course, you probably have seen this before. That some part of tone mark got cut out because of, it's not enough space. So there's some good thing about going loopless. Number 8, you are not designing by yourself. Of course not. And the reason I throw this number 8 in, there's a good reason for it, because I have seen so many great design out of some of you here in this past 10 years, and some of them are really, really interesting. But but the thing is, not many of them really solve problem. You end up with having more typeface, good-looking typeface, but it doesn't solve anything. It doesn't help improve anything. Here's a sample situation what I'm talking about. You see this liquor ad, alcohol ad, or cigarette ad with this ridiculous rule and regulation, and when I say it's a law, it's by law. You have this really tight space, and you have like unbelievable amount of text. And the law also said that you have to set it at this big, this certain point size. And then it's almost impossible to pack all this shit in this little box. It's just ridiculous. And what you see here is very famous text typeface called Phong Nam by DB, of course. Wonderful, wonderful designs. But it's got stretched out so bad. You can't even read it. Why you put a warning there when nobody can read it? It's just so stupid. Anyway, you can't go back and change the law. It's going to be a little harder than just use design to get around it. So this is what happened. I have to mention Satawit. You in here somewhere? Raise your hand. Are you in here somewhere, Satawit? Okay, up there. Okay, all right. He's came up with this idea, very brilliant idea, and he talked to me that we're gonna go ahead with this, and we look up all this law and this rule and regulation that we have to comply. And what happened is we come up with a set of Thai typeface that really stretch, and you can stretch even more, and it's still okay. It's flexible enough for you to stretch it out to match it with this the amount of text and amount and the space that you have to work on. Okay, number 9, Thai numeral. Thai numeral, the forgotten child. Somebody at the was it Lars? You asked me about Thai numeral. Or was it Oliver? Was it Oliver? Was that you? Yeah, asking me about Thai numeral. Yes, look at this. The top one is from Sukhothai period, and the second one from Ayutthaya period, and that's one from like right about now. So it's hardly changed at all. And hardly changed at all. That means the thing that you borrow from Khmer up here still exists, and it doesn't have the same rate of development compared to the rest of the script itself. All the alphabets already gone wild, and then people experiment on it. You got some new idea, very interesting stuff. But most people, especially in the early day of Macintosh, when ASCII come into play, some people even ignore some character like Kokon or Kokwat. They don't even put it in there on the keyboard, and somehow even replace Arabic numeral into Thai numeral key scripts. Just to kind of make it easy way out, because they figured out nobody's gonna use it anyway. So that's kind of attitude. The thing is, you see from this slide, you see this 1995, and that's a PSL display. Another famous loopless terminal there. Slightly condensed, well, not slightly condensed, it is condensed. But the numeral system is like pretty much the same. It doesn't really go with the alphabet at all, and it's still got a loop there. And this is the release at around 2000. So we try to improve it a little bit. And now we're on the process of making Thai numeral, the whole system, a little larger than it is, because you don't want to have the line of text, and then when you use Thai numbers, then everything just kind of go down like that. And of course, it doesn't work mathematically. You cannot go into InDesign and try to run a page number using Thai numeral. It's impossible unless you do a little cheating by placing Thai numeral into Arabic. So it doesn't work mathematically, so that's why it's not easy to use. And we only use it for what purpose? When you want to, that's one thing, funeral, yes. That's like, we all die once, right? So it's only like one time use. And the last one I throw it in, it's a poster done by Ekalak Pianpanawe, which is one of my colleagues. Where are you? Somewhere up there. Yes, kind of like try to promote the diversity of the designs of Thai numeral. And the last one is the unknown. The unknown, we cannot leave them behind. The unknown, what's the unknown? These character. This is some of the unknown. Well, let's take the last one. This one called, anybody in here know what it is? Komut. How about the use of Komut? Anybody can contribute? Any? Don't even know how to use it? Because it's so old-fashioned and nobody uses it anymore. You can't even find it on a keyboard, but it's there. You have to like do all this kind of combo key to get to it. It's just a hassle. Just drop it. In the old literature, we use komut in the old-fashioned way of writing. You put komut at sort of like work as a full stop, sort of, but it's well, not quite full stop. At the end of the chapter, so it's marked the end of the chapter. But the reasons I said you cannot leave it behind because you just never know. All these characters will, come back someday. It's put it in the context that you can relate it to. Ample at, or as you know, at signs and hashtag there. Well, of course, at sign was. Anybody know how to use at sign? What? For Instagram. Oh yes. Well, that's today context. But in the old day, you use it to define like the merchandise or like how many of them at what price. And all of a sudden, the internet come along, and at sign become like technology. Now you see this technology show on TV, and whenever they have a letter A in spelling, they put at sign there. They think it's so cool, but I always think it looks so stupid. But anyway, same as hashtag there. You use it on Twitters, on Instagram or whatever social media. So this character do come back in an unpredictable way. Just like call kon and call kuat, you just never know. Maybe they will make it. They will make a big comeback someday. So just have to do it. Don't skip and leave that grips empty. Okay, for those of you who design Thai typeface. And that would be it for tonight. Thank you and good night.
ขอบคุณครับคุณอนุทินนะครับ และพวกเราก็ต่างเฝ้ารอการกลับมาของขอคนนะครับ ลำดับต่อไปนะครับ โอ้คนนี้เจ๋งมาก คุณโรเบิร์ต บิงเฮิร์สนะครับ เป็นนักคิดนักเขียนนะครับ และเป็นดีไซเนอร์ด้วยนะครับ ซึ่งเป็นยังไงบ้างครับ สบายดีนะฮะ อ๋อ Q&A ลืม มีใครจะ Q&A ไหมครับ Does anyone want to ask any questions about this? Okay.
In Thai language, do you have italicized fonts? Do you have italic version out of in traditionally or in modern days?
Okay. Actually, there's some period that Thai typeface, well, before movable typelet come into play, people rely on just Thai script, and Thai script was actually slanted. Yes. Well, it's depend. If you want to talk about something like 700 years old, that's not slanted, but somehow it's got slanted. And most of the thing that make it slanted is the writing tool. Yes. And to extend the answer to you is we don't really have true italic. Is that what you want to ask?
Yes, we have the same troubles in Korean language. We didn't have a italicized system, but once a Western language is so popular in Korean culture, suddenly Korean type designers adapted, angulated Korean languages to slanted. So they call italicized the Korean language. But in traditional terms of it, we have our own tradition, calligraphy, speedy calligraphy style. That's another issue we need to develop also.
Okay.
That's why I'm asking you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
คุณครับมีอีกไหมฮะก่อนคุณพี่ขึ้นมาก่อน มาปีนมาครับเพื่อเป็นการขอบคุณนะครับ ขอมอบโอ้โหเสื้อยืดจากทางบ้านนะครับ
Okay.
ใส่ด้วยนะนะครับเดี๋ยวอันนี้มีภาษาไทยหรือภาษาอังกฤษตบมือกันหน่อยแหมขยับตัวหน่อยนะครับอีกสองท่านที่เราต้องขอบคุณขาดไม่ได้เลยครับคือผู้แปลครับแล้วต่อไปนะครับวิทยากรท่านต่อไปที่จะมาแนะนำวิทยากรท่านต่อไปนะครับขอต้อนรับ Mr. Lars please come up with the music
Hello. So I'm really happy to introduce you to somebody that I don't know. We met here for the first time. He's a poet. And if you are interested in poetry, he just recently released a book that he wrote, Selected Poems. He's also a linguist and a typographer. I'm sure that some of you know one of his most famous books. There are over 20 of them. It is called The Elements of Typographic Style, and it is a book that had been translated in 10 languages. And that is something really uncommon, that a book about graphic design has been translated in so many languages. So that even the big typographer and type designer Hermann Zapf said of this book, I wish to see this book become the typographer's Bible. So now you know what you have to read if you didn't read it yet. He has a strong interest in linguistics, translating works from classical Greek, Arabic, Navajo, and most significantly, Haida. So Navajo and Haida are, you don't say Indians, but indigenous nations. So the people that lived before Spanish people came to the United States of America. And what is interesting for him is he lives in British Columbia, so it's in the very north of the United States. And there, the original population of this area is called Haida. It's the nation of Northern Pacific Indians. So I'm really happy to welcome on stage for a warm applause, Robert Bringhurst. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Would you like to have this back? I'll charge you by the page. Thank you very much for inviting me here. My last trip to Bangkok was 27 years ago. It has changed a little bit since then, but it was a fascinating city, a wonderful city then, and it is a fascinating and wonderful city now. And it has been a great pleasure to me to come back. I should have consulted with Anuthin about the typeface for this first slide. I'm sure he would have had something else to recommend. But foreigners have no taste. Thank you. That's a place to start. Thank you. Some of you have come like me from far away, and perhaps not all of you know the story of the Emerald Buddha. I cannot show you a picture of the Emerald Buddha itself because true Buddha nature is of course invisible. But you can visit the Emerald Buddha if you wish in this temple, Wat Prakau, just on the other side of the river. It is said that the statue called the Emerald Buddha was carved in northern India out of a solid block of nephrite, and that it was brought from India to Thailand 22 or 23 centuries ago by Nagasena. This is Nagasena, as the Japanese know him, a sage who is famous in the Buddhist world for the acuity of his hearing. And it is said that later on, when things were not going so well for Buddhists in this country, the Emerald Buddha was hidden in the mountains at Chiang Rai in northern Thailand to protect it from people who were not in favor of enlightening their fellow beings. And then in the early 15th century, the time of Gutenberg and Van Eyck and Donatello and Brunelleschi, the statue was rediscovered. The local king, a member of the Lana dynasty that ruled northern Thailand in that period, ordered that the statue should be brought to his capital, Chiang Mai, but the elephant carrying the statue insisted on going to Lampang instead. The job was given to another elephant and then another, but the elephants kept carrying the statue to Lampang, so that is where it stayed. If you heard Stefan Sagmeister last night, you know that he is just as fascinated by elephants as I am. We all love this story because we know that elephants have minds of their own. And the elephant is a splendid example of the real world, which has a mind of its own. So, of course, you all know that in the 18th century, in the time of Kant and Goethe and Haydn and Mozart and Bodoni and the Didos for us foreigners, the statue was finally brought to Bangkok, and now it lives in that temple. But this is not a story about Immanuel Kant or Giambattista Bodoni, it is a story about elephants. In the West and in the East alike, many people are now in the habit of thinking that reality or nature is altogether passive and mindless, that it consists of nothing but resources waiting for us to do with as we please. And many people are also in the habit of thinking of images as essentially empty and utilitarian things for which we, the viewers or users or promoters, supply the meanings that we can erase or revise as we please. In fact, reality is full of elephants, and horses, and cats, and mice, and ants, and grasses, and mosses, and trees that have minds of their own, and it is full of emerald Buddhas who carry their own meanings with them from century to century and place to place. The great image of the blank slate in European culture is the blank sheet of paper. This proves that most Europeans have never looked carefully at paper. Paper is a very interesting substance, and it has a mind of its own: texture, color, aroma. Handmade paper is precious because it has these qualities like good cheese, good food. The first rule of typography is that thinking occupies space. But the first rule of space is that space is already full of thinking. These are not rules invented by Gutenberg or Aldous or Beatrice Ward or Neville Brody. They are characteristics of reality, like the laws of thermodynamics or electromagnetism, which people at any place, at any time, in any language can rediscover for themselves. Heraclitus, who lived 25 centuries ago in a small Greek town on what is now the coast of Turkey, understood this principle clearly and expressed it very succinctly, and you see it here. Everything thinks and is linked together by thinking. The first rule of typography is mirrored, of course, by the first rule of music. thinking occupies time. And the first rule of space is mirrored by that rule. Time is already full of silence and already full of thinking. When you put letter forms on paper or on stone, you are not working in a vacuum. You're in there with the elephants and the emerald Buddhas that have minds and meanings of their own, and stone, like paper, has texture and color and grain. It cuts a certain way, fractures or tears a certain way, and is changed in certain irreversible ways by heat and pressure. It is also mortal, just as we are. It has not existed forever and will not last forever, though it does usually last much longer than you or I. The Greek word on this stone is eucharisterion, which means an offering of thanks, a gift that is given by humans to non-humans. This particular piece of stone was carved about 22 centuries ago, about the time the Emerald Buddha is supposed to have been made, but it was carved on the island Melos in the eastern Mediterranean. It was carved as a votive offering for Asclepios, the god of healing and the patron of physicians. In other words, the person making this gift had been cured of some illness or injury, and he wanted to thank not just his doctor, but the forces beyond his and the doctor's control. He wanted to thank nature itself, the world in which he lived, the enormous ecosystem his little life was part of. Maybe you know another story about Asclepios, a story that Plato tells about Socrates and Asclepios. The story that Socrates was poisoned, as everybody knows, by his fellow citizens for the crime of trying to enlighten them, trying to teach their children to think. And two of Plato's dialogues are accounts of Socrates' death. In one of them, Socrates' last words are addressed to his friend Crito, and the words are, "Crito, we owe a rooster to Asclepios. Don't forget to pay." Nietzsche, the German philosopher, disliked this story intensely because he thought it meant that Socrates regarded life itself as a disease from which the death sentence had cured him. That could be true, but there are other much more interesting possibilities. Socrates never taught that philosophical argument was an end in itself. He taught that the goal of discussion is wisdom, whose proper expression is silence. Wisdom is the cure for speech, and falling back into things is the cure for rising out of them into argumentation and dialectic. Mortality is the cure for immortality. Socrates taught that oral culture is best, and writing will weaken your mind, as Alberto Mangel was mentioning earlier today. But one of the nice things about typography, one of the things typography is really good for, is keeping in touch with the past. It can even keep us in touch with Socrates. That's the only way typography can contribute to the future, is by keeping up the connection between the future and the past. If it weren't for the past, you would never be able to read what is written in the future or the present. These are Socrates' actual words, or the words that Plato put into his mouth. O Crito, to Asclepio, o Pelomen, aceret, erec truona alla aporote, kai me emelesete. Because a lot of work has been done linking the typographic future with the typographic past, we can work with these words and fonts that are based on ancient Greek inscriptions like this one, or on the Renaissance typographic tradition, which is in some respects much more sophisticated for Greek than for Latin script. There is, of course, more than one Renaissance tradition, and there are some very nice Greek faces of recent vintage. This one, for example, though only a few of the new faces are very useful for setting the very old texts. Thai, like Latin and Greek, has a rich scriptorial and inscriptional heritage, and I hope that you'll remember to keep that heritage alive in the digital age. This has nothing at all to do with making things old-fashioned. It has to do with keeping up the lines of communication between the present and the future. and the past. But let me tell you a curious thing. I live in the Western world, which is incredibly rich. It has more money than it knows what to do with. And the heritage of Greece and Rome is absolutely central to European culture. But of all these Greek fonts I have been showing you, all the Greek fonts we have in the world that are suitable for setting classical Greek and Latin literature, not one, not a single one has been made with any support from any European or North American cultural institution. No university, no museum, no library, no government ministry has contributed any support to this work. And no commercial type foundry has helped much either. The work has been done by private individuals, and the money has come from the pockets of those individuals or from small private foundations. Perhaps you will be luckier in Thailand, but based on our experience in the West, I think you have to be prepared to do this kind of work yourselves, just because it is worth doing. In other words, you have to be the elephant. You have to have a mind of your own. You have to be the Emerald Buddha. You have to remember what you mean. Let's go back to Socrates and his teachers, one of whom was Heraclitus. Space is full of thinking, and everything is linked together by thinking, not by the telephone or the internet, but by thinking. The Aitareya Upanishad, the text that is probably older than Plato and possibly older than Heraclitus, puts it this way. From the mouth came speech, and from speech fire. A nose appeared, from the nose came breath, from breath the air, the eyes appeared, from the eyes came sight, and from sight the sun. The ears appeared, and from the ears came hearing, and from hearing the four quarters. The skin appeared, from the skin came hair, and from hair the plants and trees came. And the heart appeared, and from the heart came the mind, and from the mind the moon. That may sound like a lot of postmodern nonsense, the claim that everything originates in human imagination and desire. But the only thing that makes postmodernism nonsensical is its insistence on taking its own metaphors literally. We can be pretty sure that the author of this Upanishad knows that his metaphors are metaphors, because on the very next page he turns them around and tells us that fire became speech and went into the mouth, and air became breath and entered the nostrils, and the sun became sight and entered the eyes, and the moon became mind and entered the heart, and so on. What I keep hearing in these fragments of old texts is something quite obvious and beautiful and simple. They all seem to recognize a web of productive interrelations between the things and beings of the world, including human beings. Productive interrelations instead of a predatory, parasitical arrangement in which humans make demands and nature is expected to comply. Does this only happen in ancient writings, or could it be implicit in the modern world as well? This is the British physicist and chemist Michael Faraday, who died in 1867. Many people regard him as the father of the electrical world and the electronic world because of his work in electromagnetism, but he did many other things as well. When he was lecturing on the properties of metals at the Royal Institute in London in December 1858, he said this: "I am no poet, but if you think for yourselves as I proceed, the facts will form a poem in your minds." Many artists and writers, as well as many first-rate scientists and mathematicians, have had exactly that experience of the facts forming a poem in their minds or under their hands. Why is it then that we speak so often of poets and writers and artists and type designers as people who make things or even make them up, though we are happy to say that scientists discover things. When the facts form a poem in your mind, it's because you have seen what's there. You've seen what is, achieved some kind of insight into things, and if that's what you've done, you've made a discovery, not an invention. Do they really form a poem only in your mind, or do they also form a poem, a radiant, resonant order out there in the world? Is the poem of the facts real? I think it is. This is a bundle of raffia fiber. It's dried strips of leaf from the raffia palm, which grows in many places in South Asia and is used now all over the world for wrapping, especially decorative wrapping, flowers and packages and so on. It was in the old days a utilitarian tool, and now it is a luxury item in the West. In the 20th century, there was a Dutch designer named Henk Krieger. He was born in Indonesia. He grew up there, but he worked as a typographer and designer in the Netherlands and in Canada until his death in 1979. He also made paintings and sculpture. And around 1950, he designed a typeface known as raffia. This is one of the drawings for that typeface. There is no lowercase, only capitals. It is a typeface to be used one letter at a time. The letters are so ornate that there's no point putting them together. You can see how closely this letter resembles a bundle of raffia fiber, but at the same time it belongs to the Dutch Baroque tradition of ornamental initials. So it brings together the subtropical world of palm fiber and the European world of ornamental calligraphy and engraving. And it demonstrates the fundamental link between vegetable fiber and pen strokes. In typography, the pen stroke or brush stroke or whatever kind of stroke it is the basic link to reality, that real thing. There's now a digital version of Krieger's type in which the individual strands can be colored however you please. This is a real piece of laboratory work. It is a typeface that is useful for almost nothing, but one that proves something very important about type. It shows the organic foundation of the craft. This is some of Krieger's more conventional lettering work, and here you can see what a skilled calligrapher and type designer he was. This would make a beautiful text face, although he never completed the job. This is the working hand of an old friend of mine, the poet and printer William Everson from California. And here again you see the kind of organic form that is typical of good manuscripts from any century, any age, any country. This is the kind of garden in which typography grows. It's the kind of foundation from which it starts. And here is a close-up of an anonymous Renaissance hand, a little piece of manuscript from the Vatican Museum in Rome. These letters were written around 1450, and they embody a standard that European typography has been trying to reach ever since. It is a scribal hand so good that even the mistakes are a pleasure to look at. This is the letter O from Hermann Zapp's typeface Michelangelo. It is not a circle. It is not any Euclidean or geometric figure, any constructed figure. It is an organic form. It can only be made by a living creature making a living gesture. Of course, it's metal type, so here it is backwards. That's the form that you would see when it was printed. It's an organic form enshrined in inorganic material. But type has its limits, of course, in metal and digital form as well. This is Jovita Veljovita's hand and the ex ponto typeface derived from it. It is a very nice typeface, but the type cannot do what Veljovita's brush can do, what his pen can do, and the pen owes much of what it can do to the paper it is writing on. The paper is an elephant, and so is the pen. In London in the 19th century, there were many experiments made to produce type for the blind. These experiments were also going on in Paris. The competition was won in the end by Louis Braille, whose typeface is used all over the Western world for blind people. But these are two of the British attempts to make a script for the blind, and you see how very plain and geometric they both are. One is from around 1830, the other from around 1870. At this time, there was an English missionary working in Canada who had the idea that he would make a typeface for some of the native Canadian languages that he encountered in eastern Canada, in Ontario. The languages were Ojibwe and Cree. So he developed a script using a minimal number of graphemes, a minimum number of letter forms that are designed so that they rotate through 4 different positions. The shape of the character tells you what consonant it is, and the rotation tells you what is the vowel that goes with it. There are 4 versions of 2 characters, the P and the T. This is in a typeface called Luqamak, which was designed by a young friend of mine very recently, but this is the old-fashioned kind of the script. It is very geometric, it is very plain. People write this way with ballpoint pens. The letters, they're not writing, they're printing. You know, that is, they're making these very stiff letters. But this is an alphabet that was introduced like a spaceship into a culture that had no writing of any kind. A very sophisticated culture with a great oral literature where people had been talking and telling stories for thousands of years, but they had never written anything. The missionary gave them this script. They drew the letters very carefully. And so they were really not writing or even printing, but just drawing the letters one at a time. And so they remained for a long while very simple and geometric. And the story of this type, this writing system, this script is a story of it slowly becoming humanized, slowly becoming organic, slowly recovering from its origins as a geometric construction. Here is a slightly more stylish version designed by Jim Rimmer. Here is another stylized version designed by Ross Mills. And here is the italic of that same typeface, so-called, in which finally you see the impulse to write the forms instead of draw them, finally getting into the forms themselves. They're developing some organic form. They're developing some cursive quality. They're beginning to flow. Much more of this can happen and will happen. In the meantime, of course, artists get busy as well, and they do very interesting things with letters. This is a piece of calligraphy in the Cherokee language, a Native American language, done by my friend Suzanne Moore. These letters were designed by a Cherokee named Sequoia in the early 19th century, and they too looked very geometric, very plain for a long time. People were drawing the letters because they had no tradition of writing. But as they began to write and the artists began to get involved, the letters began to develop a real organic character. And then they began to speak to one another. The history of Chinese script is very much the same. It starts off as something very geometric and angular, the old seal script characters that are drawn or carved, and it develops eventually into something that is written, and finally it develops a grammar of its own with the standard strokes and the stroke order, and then you can look up characters in the dictionary from the stroke order. No script begins with this kind of built-in grammar. It has to grow out of the historical evolution of the script, and that's what is happening now to the Cree and the Cherokee scripts. In Chinese, it's been going on for thousands of years, and so it has become something very sophisticated. This is part of a scroll written by the monk Huaisu in the 8th century. It is, many of you will know, a kind of script called Zhaoshu, grass script, very, very fluid, very, in fact, this is wild grass, crazy grass. Very different from the Kaishu forms that you would look up in the dictionary. If we slice the scroll and insert the Kaishu forms, you see the great difference between the sort of official versions of these characters and the rapid cursive versions made by the scribe. The scribe is not so much writing the characters as giving you hints to what the characters are. So it's like jazz. The character never comes out the same way twice. Yet, you know, it becomes a tradition. People can write this way. They can read what is written, and even after many centuries, 12 centuries, 13 centuries in this case, the scroll can still be read. The calligraphy can still be enjoyed. Until a few years ago, if you went up the Yangtze River, you would see on the wall of the canyon in Chutang Gorge a giant inscription, Gui Men Tian Sha Zhong, which means the Demon Gate is the most powerful landscape in China. It is not a good idea, in my opinion, to carve slogans like this into the landscape. This is not really an inscription, it's a kind of graffiti. It's a kind of stone billboard claiming something that is already obvious and doesn't need to be said. But the Three Gorges Dam took care of that. It drowned the canyon, it drowned the river, it drowned the graffiti as well. This dam is not very much like Huaisu's calligraphy. It has no organic form whatever. And the dam is big. It attempts to create its own landscape, and of course, temporarily it succeeds. But that landscape is not an ecology. It can't sustain itself in this form. In time, the silt will build up and the landscape will change back to something that can sustain itself. In the meantime, the old stone billboard is disappearing under the water. But look at those Siberian cranes flying up the river. There is more calligraphy, more design sense, more beauty, more depth in the flight of those birds than in the disappearing characters. The cranes know more about calligraphy and have a deeper connection to the ecology of meaning than those who carved those letters in the stone and were so proud of their ability to read and write. Let's jump now for a moment to the Middle East. This is the Unicode string for some Arabic characters that form two lines of poetry by the earliest woman poet in the Arabic language, Tumatar al-Khansa. She lived in the 6th century, 800 years before the Emerald Buddha was rediscovered at Chiang Rai. Here are 4 possible realizations of exactly the same string of Unicode information. In each case, exactly the same data, but you got 4 quite different results, and so these 4 incarnations of the same text say different things. The first 2 are full of the sophistication of Arabic script of the Golden Age. They are examples of some of the best typesetting that has ever been done in the Arabic script. The 3rd and 4th versions are modern attempts to simplify Arabic and bring it down to the level of Latin machine typography. Simplification is not necessarily bad, and sophistication is not necessarily good, or the other way around. Any script that lives a full life needs both simple forms and sophisticated forms, and it will develop them. The history of writing systems is usually a series of movements back and forth, a series of waves in which the script goes through phases of greater and greater sophistication, complication, and then it goes through phases of simplification again, and back and forth like And after a long period of waves flowing like this, you get something really complex like the heritage of Chinese script, or the heritage of Greek script, or the heritage of Latin script. And if you let that heritage die, then all those waves disappear like the Yangtze River under the dam. And if you keep them alive, then you have that legacy from the past. The reason Latin type has an uppercase and a lowercase is because those are the fruits of some of these waves of complication and simplification. The reason it has Roman and italic is because those are some of the results of some of these waves once again. In Arabic script at the present time, these cycles have been collapsed and the script is being pulled fiercely in both directions at once, becoming more and more sophisticated through the skillful application of digital technology to a very sophisticated old scribal tradition, which you see in the top two lines here. And it's being simplified, quite deliberately and brutally simplified, in order to make it less expensive to work with, in order to make it more childlike, in order to make it more innocent, but especially to make it more European, more Western, more part of the global world that so many people aspire to belong to. Maybe the same thing is happening in Thailand. I have not been here long enough to know. But the great Norwegian ecologist and philosopher Arne Næss has something useful to tell us on the subject of ecosystems. Ecosystems, he says, are very complex, but they are not complicated. They are mostly free of clutter. They never try to prove that they are more sophisticated than the ecosystem next door or more sophisticated than their parents. They just grow when they need to grow and shrink when they need to shrink. They become more complex when they are overfed and simpler when they are underfed or when they need to escape from something. They shrink when they need to shrink, grow when they need to grow. The ecological economist Herman Daly has something important to say on this subject too, which is that growth itself is not necessarily good, nor is it necessarily bad. That growth can be economic or uneconomic. It is uneconomic when the social and environmental costs exceed the benefits, as they often do in the modern world. Finally, I would like to quote another friend of mine, the Canadian philosopher Jan Zwicky. Being, she says, is the interconnectedness, the resonant ecology of things. The meaning of what is the live metaphorical relation between things and the resonant structure of the world. To know the meaning of what is wisdom. This is what elephants think about when they decide where they will carry emerald Buddhas. And this is what calligraphers think about when they are making beautiful letters. Not how much money they're going to make, not how they will spend the money they do make, but the work they are doing. The beauty of the world that they are joining, that they are becoming part of by making what they make, by doing their work. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Q&A session. Anyone got any question? มีใครถามอะไรไหมครับ Okay. So we would like to thank, in behalf of the partner, we would like to. Now we got a new package. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay. ครับตอนนี้เราจะพักเบรกกันประมาณ20นาทีนะครับกลับมาอีกทีตอน 15:50 นาที 3:50 นะครับข้างนอกตรง register มีของแจกนะครับ We're gonna break for 20 minutes and please come back at 15:50. Please get your freebies at the registration outside. See you in
Hold it for a moment. Yes, thanks.
อืมเจอกันนะครับสวัสดีครับสวัสดีครับสองท่านสุดท้ายของวันนี้นะครับแต่อย่าลืมก็ย้ำอีกทีว่าพรุ่งนี้มีนะครับบรรยากาศต่างไปเพราะว่าคนละที่นะครับพรุ่งนี้ที่คอมดีจุฬานะครับห้องก็คล้ายๆอย่างนี้นะครับสว่างกว่าหนาวกว่าเอาแจ็คเก็ตไปด้วยนะฮะผมเคยไปนั่งฟังบรรยายที่นั่นมีคนประมาณแบบว่า150ก็ยังหนาวอยู่นะครับลำดับต่อไปนะครับสองท่านสุดท้ายของวันนี้นะครับคือคุณแกรี่ Leonidas sorry Gerry Leonidas นะครับ and Mr. Lars Harmsen และผู้ที่จะมาแนะนำนะครับดีไซเนอร์ชื่ออะไรนะครับคุณเจอรัดsorry Mr. Gerard Mr. Gerard gonna give the introduction to Gerry please get in
Ladies and gentlemen, it is a real pleasure to introduce to you my friend and colleague from Reading, Gerry Leonidas. Originally he comes from Athens, now he is located in Reading, and he has just admitted to having written some poetry when he was very young and wanting to write a lot of prose when also he was young, and he was told to wait till he was older. And now that he is older, he has no time to write. And that is because he is a brilliant educator. As head of the Master for Type Design at the Department of Typography of the University of Reading. And it is from this background that he will talk to you and will definitely enlighten you. Gerry, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. I'd like to start by reading out a poem. No. I'm messing with you. Okay, good afternoon. I hope you're not too tired. Boris used the word seismograph somewhere in the program about typefaces being seismographs, and it reminds me of expressions I've used when I'm talking about typefaces being mirrors of things. And I use that metaphor a lot because typefaces do reflect things that are happening around, and they do tell stories. In themselves, they're not very interesting. They're just bits of black stuff on a screen or on paper, but behind them they have a lot of humanity. They have a lot of stories about how people solve problems, how do they communicate, how do they try to investigate what's going on, and how do they compete to make something that is both socially acceptable, both competent for the job it has to do, but also distinctive and gives them identity. It's also about locations, it's about times, it's about genre, and it's about communities and societies. Again, they do not exist in a vacuum. They tell us stories about technology, they tell us stories about the economy that surrounds them, and they also tell us about how people try to find opportunities to distinguish themselves. There is another more interesting aspect to it, where design also in its wider expressions has a role, but typefaces are quite distinctive in this. Typefaces reveal the tension in each society between tradition and modernity, and this is one of the most interesting aspects in them that we're going to talk about it. The most important thing is to try to address this condition with three kinds of integrity, doing three things well: linguistic, cultural, and typographic integrity. Now, linguistic is relatively easy to tick off because there is an established community of researchers and educators and practitioners whose job it is to keep current with the changing form of language. They publish resources, reference works that allow us to go and see what current form the language takes, if there's any changes in expressions, in the combinations of words and letters that are being used, what is the current situation with loan and imported words, and so on. The problems in this area would lie much more in the channels between typographers and type designers and linguists rather than in the documentation of these problems. So you might have something like this. This is a capture of a tweet from a few weeks ago where a Slovenian person, alias, has his name with his diacritics, and they are meaningful. They influence the way the name is pronounced. In one instance. In the other instance, in the Twitter handle, the diacritics are not there because the Twitter handle has a very low character set at its disposal. And then his reference to names up there, again, omits diacritics. Again, there's some sort of dilution of the language. And that is important because it means that it forces people to have some elasticity in how they accept language. And what is quite meaningful in terms of the pronunciation and often the meaning is now something that has to be taken as an optional effect and something that is not necessarily as strong associated with the language. Germans in the audience will be very familiar with the rapid abandonment of the umlaut in any form of online communication. Suddenly it became accepted to have an E next to a vowel instead of an umlaut, and that battle, I think, got lost very quickly. And there's many more complex forms than this. If you start looking at the range of diacritics that people use, even in the Latin script, they are meaningful and they are important, and it is rather too simple-minded to try to do away with them. There are other cases where we see that users develop a flexibility for writing because the technology forces them to. Now, scripts like the Arabic are particularly difficult to represent in small screens. And for many years, mobile phones in the Arabic world would only do Latin characters. So a whole generation of Arabic speakers would transcribe Arabic in Latin characters. It was essentially a phonetic transcription with informal conventions for it, which survived long after the technology allowed phones to type Arabic. Now, if you walked up to a group of native Arabic speakers and said, we think it would be good for you to abandon your script that you've been using for centuries and has this long tradition, and you should adopt the Latin script, there would be a revolution. Actually, there's been revolutions for much smaller things. And yet, people very quickly showed an accommodation to a very different form of their language than they were used to. Thankfully, this changes. This is Persian Facebook, a Facebook friend of mine, where we can see both Arabic transcription and Latin transcription in the same page. So these things still have quite a lot of elasticity in them. Cultural integrity is something quite fascinating for people who travel internationally, and especially expatriates like myself. So if I think of myself as Greek, this is something that I might have in my mind. I wake up every morning in Athens and I see the Parthenon there, and it reminds me that 2,500 years ago, people who were supposed to be my ancestors had some illustrious output that defined all sorts of ideas and things. And Robert Bringhurst graciously borrowed from these earlier. So you might be thinking of the sources that are associated with these grandeurs. Look at the epigraphical museums and you'll find letters that are well-formed and well-behaved for their style. And although these are quite small, they're actually quite neat and tidy. So this is one form of cultural integrity because it is correct for its context. But then if you travel a bit north and go to Delphi, you will find in the base of a monument something like this, if you can see it. This is ancient graffiti. So it is people who are not part of the ceremonies carving their own dedications to Apollo. And it is slightly different forms because they're Hellenistic, so they borrow some of the forms of the Roman letters, and they're not as tidy, but they're also part of the tradition. And then you have a tradition that has complexity. So there's a Byzantine tradition that's extremely strong and arguably much more dominant for my nationality, that are much more complex. They are much more accommodating of difference and influences than you would expect with something as clean as tidy as classical antiquity. And it's interesting to note that to the side, to the left of the temple there, there's the remnants of an ancient temple, and it shows you this hybridization of architecture and of resources, where bits of that ancient temple are probably integrated into the church because it's easy. That's ready-made stone there. You can take it and build your church with. I'm not showing you the next picture from this, where the young man, my nephew, is looking at a digital representation of the church, and I find this ironic that he's got the real thing next to him, but he prefers to look at it through the tablet. But that's just me getting old. Inside the church, there would be things like this, which are part of the tradition again, and they look nothing like the architectural forms that we've seen carved in stone, or things that might be quite ceremonial. But these are almost faded paintings, frescoes on the walls of the church, and they have forms of the letters that are part of the tradition, and perhaps they have not survived so strongly because they were never written informally, but they are still there. And this messy tradition might include an urban environment that looks nothing like the beauties of classical Greece. It is as dense as Bangkok is, and it's a rare moment here that I took the picture because the road is not full of cars. If you go to Greece, you will feel perfectly at home. You will not think that you've left Bangkok. We have just as much traffic there as you do here. And our buildings are plastered with all sorts of advertising and signs, and you can see there's doctor signs up there. They just slap things on the side of buildings because they want to attract the passers-by. It's like a visual trading fair. And that sits alongside things like this, which would be an Estienne edition from the 1570s with all the complexities of the highest quality of typography that you could do at the time for texts that that require that kind of complexity. Sitting alongside something very ephemeral and something that tries to, again, visually shout and attract attention. And all of this is also culturally relevant and also demands attention by the designer, the typographer. And inside these things, you might find documents that are new kinds of documents. They don't have the clarity of Estienne's documents, where there's just a single language and a very flat hierarchy with a text that starts and then goes on for pages. But you might have something like this, which tells you which bars to visit when you're in Cuba. So there's plain words, and there's imported words, and there's names of bars, and then there's addresses and all of these things. And this is not unique, of course, to us. I started looking around me my first time in Thailand, and I, just like a child, try to explore my visual environment, and I just see things like this. And they are just as complex visually as the things that I'm used to seeing in England and anywhere in Europe or anywhere I travel. I cannot read the thing, but I can read the document. I can deconstruct it, and I can understand which bits are important, which are less, which bits look like advertising, and which bits are content, which bits are captions to images, and which bits are explanations to other stuff. So I can prioritize visually the document even though I cannot read the letters. So the typography is actually quite shared. There's a very strong common denominator. Now this is because the roots of this deconstructed layout are common, and they have very identifiable sources. They all stem from the mid-80s onwards. This is a spread from Emigre, where people explored the new technologies and new forms that the liberation from the handmade allowed them. So this idea that you could compose a document not by arranging neat little bits of stuff, metal, film, whatever, paper, but actually being able to layer virtual representations of things, this was something entirely new. And of course, people tried to do these things. And from the late 80s, a spread from Octavo, again, something that says, we can actually now typeset a huge line across the fold, so let's do it. Clearly, from a typography point of view, from the point of the user, this is nonsense. Nobody wants to read that line. It goes all the way across, and by the time you've reached the end, you really don't know where to begin again. But you do it for a few times to show that you can do it. In a sense, I've done this, tick that box, then go on. And then you settle down, and you settle down into things that look like this. I bought this yesterday at the store near where we live, and it is entirely familiar to me. I would say I haven't seen many Thai people who look like this, but this shows you an interesting process where a brand is imported and the typography gets imported, but also a lot of assets get imported. And the assets would be photography, would be filmmaking, alongside color palettes and type. And perhaps the presence of, let's say, imported photographs shows you the level of investment in the enterprise, that it was too expensive to reshoot those images with people who look like the community that this is addressed to. Or perhaps there is some element of aspiration there, of a middle class that wants to borrow the more European influences of these things. I don't know, because the advertising inside this magazine is for people who make much more money than I do. I cannot afford the stuff that's in there. But again, the layout is not foreign to me. Even though it's in Thai, I can understand exactly what's there. And I find it very interesting, and not just in this magazine, that a lot of the display typography is in Latin. Now, is this because perhaps the audience differentiates itself because it is more familiar with English terminology and therefore accepts it more easily? Perhaps because this kind of typesetting is cooler, is seen more hip and of the moment. Or because the typography that they want to achieve there in the imported brand is much more easy to achieve using the Latin typefaces. Because the stuff that Anuthin was showing earlier of coordinated typeface families are not as common. So when the brand manual comes from wallpaper, and it's an extremely tightly defined brand manual, it says we need typefaces that have this strength, this boldness, that much ink on the paper, that will be used for headlines, and the subheadings will do this, and the captions will do this. And you look at your palette of typefaces, and there's not enough there. So there's all sorts of conditions that look into this. That feeds into typographic integrity. So you look at things like that in there, and clearly there's something missing. If I were a young Thai designer, I'd say, I need to design myself a really bold Thai typeface that will also be text friendly and not too wide, so I can actually fit titles and so on. You've probably done it, right? Yeah. Because then I go and see things like this in text, and I don't need to read Thai to know that actually this is not very readable, because white type on yellow is just not good. And I know that the way to deal with this is to have more space devoted to the letter forms, because I need a clear distinction between the bit that's letter and the bit that's counter. So I would say, oh, I need a reverse type version for this Thai that says, give me more space for the white, so I can have more contrast with the boundary. And I can make this decision regardless of whether I can read the damn thing. Then things where you find disconnects in typography. This is something that I saw the other day at the MBK, and clearly Starbucks says, use scripty thing for the Frappuccino ad, but there's no scripty thing for the Thai. Now, this bit in Thai looks exactly like the stuff that I saw in prose. I went to the bookshop and looked at what looked like novels in Thai, and they had the same typeface. I don't think we all speak in the same tone. It would be like I'm giving all this talk in this tone and nobody changes anything. It's really boring, and 15 minutes later you're all asleep. Typography talks in different tones, and we need this kind of thing. So we need the ephemeral scripted type, and we need the bold, and we need the different versions for them. So how to do stuff? I'm going to show you how we do things at Reading, and how do we help students who are not native to a language develop this expertise. We do things by working along 4 axes. First of all, we examine typeface design as something that exists in a business environment. It is initially an industrial environment for centuries, and as it has moved onto computers, it's really a professional environment rather than an industrial environment. But in this move, there are interesting observations. There's a Stanhope press, the first iron press from 1806. It is very interesting because it signifies typography's real entry into the Industrial Revolution. Although the Industrial Revolution starts earlier, for typography it really starts with this thing, where you can have the precision that metal casting allows you, and also the surface that allows you to do different kinds of publications. But both this technology and the next technologies that followed it, rotary presses and so on throughout the 19th century, and then hot metal typesetting, were technologies that were open to the user. They are all distinctly 19th century technologies in the sense that the users of the machine can understand how the machine operates. You can take the thing apart and you can figure out how it works. It's like a super complex Lego piece. Whereas The next thing is something completely different, and its immediate predecessors, early phototypesetting machines, were also a bit like this. They introduced a different way of thinking into the machinery. A class of professionals who were first opticians or electronic engineers and then software engineers joined in and said, this is a black box. You don't need to know what's going on there, and this thing will do stuff, and you have to accept the way it does things. So there's this tension now between users of a machine who do not have the privilege of knowledge of how the machine operates. Thankfully, it's not so disconnected, because each new technology solves always the problems of the previous technology. The same way Gutenberg's type looks exactly like the handmade books, and the first hot metal machines reproduce foundry type, and the first phototype setting environments have as models hot metal type. So all the language that we use in computers has its roots in something like this. And if you look at this, you have most of what you know to begin thinking about the limitations of typeface development. In this case, we have something that really is all about the right angles in 3 dimensions, but especially here. And even the engraving that you see at the top, even though it looks like it is an organic shape, it is actually designed so that it will fit in a grid of right angles. So the disconnect with this image that we saw earlier is very obvious, that you have centuries of things that fit next to each other and actually do not mix text and images very much. And until DTP, it is very rare to see text and images superimposed. You will almost never see text at angles. You will very rarely see text at different sizes or different typefaces on the same line, simply because it's very difficult and goes against the mental model of the machine. And you have this profession that produces all these documents, which thankfully leave us evidence of decisions. This is a drawing from 1952, a Metro black, italic. A beautiful document that is an engineering drawing. Although we see it as a piece of design, a metallurgical engineer would know exactly what to do with this. For them, it's a pattern. It's a model from which they can make matrices. And it's a proper industry. This is a picture from the monotype drawing office from the 50s. And I don't know if it's visible. Most of the people there are young women. This is interesting on 2 counts. First of all, because they're women. And there's this myth that perhaps there are not enough women in design. Well, they are. We just don't know their names. The second is that they're young, which means that they were taken from school, they were trained as draftspersons, and then after a few years, they would be let go, and a next generation we brought in. At that time, they would all be let go when they married, because they were not allowed to work when they were married. But it's this idea that what we consider design today was an industrial process for people who were nameless, and for people who didn't make decisions the way we would think about them. What is interesting, however, is that throughout this period, a lot of the established criteria remain the same. So again, a 1570s Estienne shows us how the type might be completely worn in some cases because it's the same that's being used and reused, and it's this back in the case, and they get banged together or they fall on the floor. So that A there is almost losing its formal integrity. However, it's perfectly readable, because the space around it survives and because the relationship with other letters is coherent internally. So it has enough A-ness in relation to other shapes to convince us that this is what it is. It looks perfectly fine to us. And then if you look at the proportions once the paragraph is composed, nothing has changed very much. This is from the Encyclopédie, a product of the Enlightenment, the Wikipedia of the 18th century. This is a lesson for people who think that things are new today. Even things like Wikipedia have been done before. They're just much more difficult to own or to access. And this is iBooks. You think, how different could you have an 18th century book and something on my iPhone? And yet the typography is very similar. The patterns of white and black are identical essentially. The proportions between the X height and the line spacing are extremely close. Once we found this sweet spot of proportions and alignments, we haven't changed very much. We're adapting them so that we just keep to the same thing. The second area, how things that we make in order to typeset stuff influence the forms. I've talked already about the force of the rectilinearity. However, Foundry type is completely open-ended when it comes to how many of these things do you have. You're only limited by the space you have to store type cases and the investment you're going to make in actually casting type and keeping metal there, because that's just wealth sitting there. You're also limited indirectly by how much money you're going to pay your typesetters, who might need to remember where the cases are and how many they need to use. And there are stories about how much more expensive Greek typesetters are because they have to figure out where letters are on 4 type cases instead of just the 2 that the Latin typesetters need to. But the moment you start industrializing the process, you have things like this. This is a monotype matrix that has 16 by 17 rows. But this is Arabic. And if you really want to do Arabic with all its complexity, which is clearly what you needed to do at the time, 250 odd characters are not enough. And you will notice that they are aligned one over the other, so they don't have an infinity of widths. So you do not have the resolution that you had in Foundry type. So we see that the next technology improved on one level, because it improves on speed, it improves on the ability to always print with freshly minted type, so the image is crisper. It saves you a lot on not having to store the type, so you never run out of a specific letter when you're typesetting a book. However, it introduces its own set of limitations because it cannot have any kind of width that you want. In this case, it has an 18 unit width, so you can only have one of 18 possible widths in your letters, and you cannot have any distribution that you want because the machine needs to have 5 letters of 11 units and 5 letters of 12 units and so on. So you have to design your letters accordingly. So next time you look at linotype typefaces and you wonder why the italics are very wide, it's because the matrices had the regulars and the italics on the same matrix. So you needed the italics to be as wide enough as the uprights. It was not a design decision, it was design accommodating the technology. So when phototypesetting came, that stuff was fairly quickly translated into the same forms, but with the same limitations, which were then very quickly translated into the first digital typefaces, which initially had even more limitations. They could only fit 128 characters, which was close to what your typewriter can get, and for many years settled on 256 characters in total. Those of you who are my age will remember very clearly the problems of typesetting books and not having enough characters in the font and having to use a second font to access some accented characters or access the full range of characters that you needed. Now, if you're typesetting a book, that's a nightmare because you cannot specify your spacing across typefaces efficiently. It increases the potential problems when you're typesetting. Now, I mentioned typewriters. This is my student Toshi looking into an Arabic typewriter. Now, typewriters, those of you who were at the exhibition will remember me saying, are hugely important because they're simple machines, relatively cheap, that are everywhere for decades, and they define the default form of the language, the stuff that you see in your contracts, in your schoolwork, and everything. So the absolute minimum is what the typewriter represents. So if you want to sell something in a market, you go and look at the typewriters, you begin to see what are the options. And a lot of them are ingenious machines that try to solve very difficult problems with a very limited set of forms. But you have to remember that this is a machine that strikes little bits of metal, and it needs tolerances, and it needs to make sure that the little bit of metal doesn't jam with the next one. So if you want things to join, it's actually really difficult to do with a typewriter. And you need to be really ingenious with how you move the paper, perhaps, or how you push the limits of how steep the shoulders of the type can be. Now, when you go to make the next technology, you don't really have the typewriter. You have the evidence of the typewriter, which is the printed sheets. And the sheets themselves don't tell you about the limitations of the technology that are reflected in the design. So it's much more difficult to deconstruct these. So you take the printed sheets as examples of what you need to do. So there's unintended consequences there. There's further knock-on effects in how the typesetting environment has to do with design choices. I already mentioned the limitations in character sets. It took nearly 20 years for us to be able to design typefaces with very wide character sets. This is Garamond typeface by Adobe with over 2,000 glyphs, and it will have Cyrillic and Greek and all the stuff that you could possibly want to typeset most of the European languages. But if you can see on the side, the notation for Cyrillic is not human friendly. It says Adobe character set and ISO character set and all that stuff, which means nothing. The stuff that really matters is whether it is Russian Cyrillic or Belarusian Cyrillic or Ukrainian or Bulgarian or Macedonian or Serbian, because this is what's meaningful to communities. People want to know whether this thing ticks the box Bulgarian Cyrillic or Russian Cyrillic rather than some standards. So things like that that relate to how users on the ground receive the typefaces are much more important. And then the typesetting environment and what it allows us to do. This is an image of metal Gujarati. And again, it holds all the limitations of making things fit within the forms. But then the digital environment allows you to do quite a lot of interesting stuff. So you are liberated from the problems of overhanging forms. And you can define a lot of alternate shapes that make full use of all the contextual refinements that you could possibly want. The interesting thing is what happens when you throw these into a typesetting environment. This is what InDesign looks like if you're typesetting any kind of document. It is, again, answering the problems of the previous technology. The previous technology was one where designers would essentially compose a document on a desktop, literally a desktop, or a light table, if you were lucky enough to afford one, with bits of paper or film, as if you were making a collage. You were essentially making a collage of a document that you were then photographing and reproducing. So the digital implementations of these reproduce these metaphors of a desktop and a thing that has borders that is fixed in the thing. And it also introduces new limitations. So it asks you how many columns do you want your document to have, but it doesn't ask you, do you want your columns to be the same width? You have to know that it's hiding that question because it's actually not very easy for the dialogue to have this refinement, where it's very easy to say just how many columns do you want. It takes us, again, quite a lot of time to realize that this is essentially a very old style of composing documents with intelligence for text flow and appearance markup. It is not very intelligent in how it allows us to handle large documents. It's taken us quite a bit of time to start to see new things emerging that are coming from the web design environment. And this is interesting because you need a fundamental shift in how people use documents and consume documents. And in this case, the introduction of a new community of professionals into the design process who bring a different way of thinking. They're perhaps refreshed, they're better at asking questions that are a bit embarrassing. And it's the same thing that we need here. Because again, you have documents like this that have quite a lot of layers. And perhaps they have a lot of conditions that the traditional typography has not foreseen. In this case, we have parallel texts where you might need to have indications of hierarchy, relative positioning, and things that might be links to other stuff, annotations and so on. If this were online, we can very easily expect that someone will add that link as a reader that they will then circulate to their community of friends with other annotations on. So you can imagine up to 4 levels of annotations if you look at documents that will need to be embedded in the document somehow. And the typography needs to reflect this, to show us that this is not the author's voice, that is the first reader's voice or the annotator's voice. And the most interesting case is when people have to look at the tension between tradition and modernity. This is something that is constant and cyclical and the most fascinating, I think, aspect of design. So you might have letter forms that are like this Tibetan scroll that are extremely formal and carefully written because the text probably is important, the sacred, but also because there's a lot of investment in it. And then you might have things like this, which is an extremely rare document, because if you're a good student, at the end of the day, you wipe your piece of blackboard clean for the next day. But this shows you how people write the letters. And it's a very interesting exercise to compare this with the more formal letters, because this gives you some idea of what perhaps the essential form of the letters might be. And then if you're going into Thailand as a complete novice like me, you cannot help but notice things like this. I have no idea whether to you this is good or acceptable or horrendous or what, but I don't see the funky guy on the left. I see those letters. And I'm thinking, somebody is making scripted typefaces and they're actually putting them on a piece of packaging. Now, because I'm here only now, I don't know whether this brand will go out of business because people don't like that type. There's a chance that this might be there. But I'm assuming that if they operate like others in the business, they have probably entrusted the choices to people who know that this is okay. It's acceptable enough by the target audience to just make it distinguishable, but not so much that they will say, I don't want to read this. So perhaps this connection between writing and typography is entirely appropriate in some environments and offers some opportunity for invention. And then I thought, okay, that's packaging, so that's a thing on its own. But then I go into a bookshop, and again, I see a lot of scripty lettering on the covers. So there's some different context there, that perhaps this is an acceptable style of lettering in some conditions. So how can this enrich perhaps the forms of typography? So if we're looking at coordinated type families, could they have informal versions as well as the very bold versions? And at Chula, there was something like this. It was a nice blackboard with beautiful writing. I don't know if it's beautiful. It looked beautiful to me because I liked the curves, and they had a certain control in them that I admired, and I thought this person actually has a good control in the wrist. And what I liked most was that the one on the right doesn't have a curve and then a straight line, but has a gentle modulation in the radius, and there's a tighter curve and then a smoother curve, and it holds the form together. It looks like it's all written in one continuous stroke with a lot of confidence. And I thought, that's nice. I won't take a picture of this. And then as I was walking, I had to look down as I'm walking because the pavement outside Chula is really torn up. I see this. And this was on one of these, this is some like sewer works or something, right? It was one of these massive cast concrete covers for the sewers. And I stopped and I looked at this and I thought, this is actually beautiful, because somebody carved this curve with a lot of care, and there's again the same kind of fluency in the shape. And I thought, if they can do this quite beautiful curve in concrete with a piece of stick or a screwdriver or something, then there's something there. There's beauty in this form that I would want to know more about. And for me, it's also interesting that when I was sort of hacking the slides, I couldn't get very easily the curve with my vectors. And this is a hint for how the difference between sketching and vector tools is very obvious for the inexperienced designer. That you have forms that are, the more beautiful they are, they often might be, the more difficult they might be to capture in outlines. So quite a lot of care might be needed there. In the exhibition at Chula, there was also the original of this letter. It's a letter from Walter Tracy, John Dreyfus from March 1968. That's 45 years ago. And he points to the fact that Frutiger's use of monoline forms, he was talking about Indian scripts, was already evident in India, that there was nothing new about that in itself. And indeed, that those simpler forms were very well recorded in one of the key reference editions on Indian scripts. And indeed, if you go to India, you will find, especially at the time that Tracy was writing, a relatively conservative typography for texts, but a profusion of forms in lettering and display. There is a lesson there that forms do not have any inherent meaning. There is nothing in a stroke with low modulation that says this is modern or contemporary or of its time, whereas a form that might have a lot of modulation might be traditional or ancient. These are all dependent on the context. familiar on the paragraph level, so the line spacing and the length of the line need to be familiar. The text sizes need to be familiar. But then you have this idea of parallel news items that you need to navigate, but you don't have the conventions that are present in a newspaper, for example. Or you might have content that changes depending on what it is that you're doing. Or content that changes depending on what you have done before, if it remembers your choices. You also have things that change very much in formats. So what works in a large format and has the luxury of space might not work very well in small formats. So what is it that you've got? And this is an interesting example. Quartz is one of the best news sites that exists only online. What's left when you take away the space and the luxury to have images? It's just the typefaces and color patterns and a bit of spacing arrangement. And the typefaces become extremely important in maintaining the integrity of the document, but also carrying over the brand. Now, I'm going to round this up like Erdunga, showing you some work by designers designing non-native languages to them. This is Qatari by Erin McLaughlin. It's a Devanagari typeface that happens to have a Latin with it. Erin designed the Devanagari as a priority. She used the approach and the tools that she used to model the Devanagari to design the Latin. So it's a different approach. This is an Armenian that is on exhibition at the Goethe Institute. It takes the very well-established tradition in Armenian typefaces of having an upright and an inclined style, which for centuries have existed quite independently for main texts, and formalizes a distinction that was gradually creeping into Armenian typography of having a primary and a secondary style. Now this, you might say, is a sign of Armenia moving closer in its typography to established styles of the West. I think it might have to do with a younger generation being more open and more flexible in how they read things. Although I have championed for this typeface to be awarded an award, I don't think it really hits the sweet spot. I think it could have better resonance with the traditional forms of the inclined styles. But it shows that typography has the capacity to reinvent itself and to explore opportunities. And as Armenia grows in the kind of documents it produces, and perhaps the kinds of magazines that are published have more complex typographic styles, things like this might be more useful. Florian Runge's Nomad not only looks at the relationship across modulations, low modulation and high modulation styles, in better terms than serif and sans serif, but also tries to imagine the same treatment in Devanagari in this case. communities of designers who are interested in typeface design in areas where there wasn't that much happening other than just servicing main texts. So there might be hand lettering for advertising and just a few main text typefaces for the main publications. And I think what we're seeing now, like the presence of all you people here, is exactly the rising of this interest and exploring, the desire to explore the typographic variety of a specific script for the range of publications that are produced. So if you go and look out there in any of the magazines and books and publications that are available to Thai readers, then you can work backwards from this and try to see what are the typefaces that need to be designed for these. And they don't need to map onto stuff that's happening in Latin or Cyrillic or Greek or anything else, but they do need to meet the expectations of readers and document designers for complexity and refinement and identity. And that is one of the main things, again, that the same way typography is complex in its expressions and its ranges, so typeface design can meet this complexity with a range of forms and identities. And I'm going to leave it there with the injunction that you go out and design lots. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Gerry. Are there any questions?
Hey! Cool.
Are there any questions?
No questions? You scared them off.
So there's a gift from my dad, Boris.
No, from the partners.
And from the partners.
You can't avoid coming up on stage. Thank you so much. Super. Yeah.
So the next speaker is a rocker from Germany. And he's called Lars Harmsen, and he has the theme Slanted Ghost, Typo Lyrics, Identity and Culture.
And
Gerry's gonna tell you something about him.
Yeah, I'm hooking you up. Okay.
Hast du gut gemacht.
You're on. Okay.
Ja, okay.
I'm introducing you?
You don't have.
Oh, whose turn is it? Hey!
time over, you could go and I stay here. This, when we talk about identity, it comes to say from where we are. My company is called Magma, and we are in the heart of Europe, in Germany, quite far away from this place here. If we look closer at the German map, we're in the south of Germany, and 3 hours away of Munich. Munich is known for being the capital of beer. And you might know Munich because of one of the biggest events. It's the Oktoberfest. So forget everything about BMW, based in Munich. Forget everything about Mercedes, Porsche, Audi. That's not Germany. It's not about Jill Sander. It's not about Boss. It's not about Goethe. It's not about Wagner. It's about Oktoberfest. So Oktoberfest is one of the biggest parties in Germany. And actually a lot of foreigners come there to drink beer, to meet girls, to get drunk. It's a real confusing mess, a little bit as confusing as my life. So I'm on one hand side running a company called Magma Brand Design, and we started with an office in Munich, Melville, because we had clients there. 96 I started with a type label called Volcano Type. Slanted blog is something I'm gonna show you, and the Bastard project, a small side project. And why I showed you those images is that I'm just working on a beautiful book from photographer Volker Derlath about the Oktoberfest, and it will hopefully be released beginning of next year. So I'm not a typographer, I'm not a graphic designer, I'm not a photographer, I don't know what I am. So back to our roots, or where we come from. We're like an hour drive from Frankfurt, close to the French border, excellent food over there. The town where I come from is known for its castle, and the castle had been built around 1600 by this guy here, Markgraf Karl Wilhelm. And he was inspired by the French king Roi Soleil. So he asked the architects of those who built Versailles, the big castle in close to Paris, to rebuild this castle. and paying the price of a one-color print, but having at the end a display of a few different covers. It's nice for marketing. It's nice for putting those kind of magazines in bookshelves, because you could display something that is just beautiful. Of course, it's about identity also, what I'm doing. I've recently been in Poland, and if you have a close look of what is happening here, it's really weird. This typeface is called commercial script. And in Poland, they have all those kind of weird letters and a beautiful L. And what happens is they just, you know, cut out this little thing and sticked it on there. And it's the identity of the bus stops of Krakow, a historic town. So they spend millions to get tourists there every year. It's a beautiful city, and they don't invest 1 cent in the corporate design and signage system. So it's obvious that it is about identity. Last year, we had the opportunity to visit Yerevan, and I've never seen a place where the presence or the typography is everywhere, all around. Armenian people are really very proud of their typeface. And the guy who created this typeface is called Mestrop Mashtot, and he is buried in a small place called Oshakan. It's this chapel that you see on one of those here. And we had the opportunity to visit this chapel. And it's a place where millions of Armenians go every year just to go to this graveyard and put a flower. And he died 1,600 years ago. And a lot of Armenians say that they're still alive, or that they just exist because of this typeface. And close to this graveyard is a stone graveyard with all those Armenian letters. They're pretty big like this. So it's really obvious that typeface is also about identity. It is also about having ideas. One of our ideas we had a couple of years ago really worked out to be very successful. It's a calendar. It works, it's like in a small box. You open the box, you have a very small, tiny calendar. Each day is a different typeface on the front. On the front, you have the typeface itself, and on the back side, the explanation of whom it was done. The idea was so successful that we just copied and pasted it on another kind of product, a polladarium. I think that, yeah, we are really, we just love those kind of old things that are disappearing, like Polaroid pictures. So again, here the idea is very simple. It's just on the front side, a picture, and on the back side, you'll find the story of the picture done by the photographer. Our work is a lot about branding. I'm going to showcase 2 projects, one for Linotype and the other one for Adidas. Linotype has a long tradition in selling typefaces, but their marketing tools were really bad. And then a couple of years ago, they commissioned us to redesign an old friend of them, this Fonts and Focus. So it's a magazine promoting the fonts, and they wanted to give it a new kind of look and feel, feeling that they were just full of dust and old-fashioned somehow in their presentations. So we recreated this magazine in a more magazine-like way. And the art director was really very critical about the skateboard here on the back page, and saying, no, we couldn't show a skateboard on the back page of a Linotype brochure, just to show you how crazy sometimes things are. For me, it's just, yeah, part of the culture today. But it was very successful. The magazine helped Linotype to sell a few more fonts. They commissioned us to design a calendar, huge calendar in A0 format. So every day or every month, we created those poster sheets, a lot of color again, a lot of typography. And mainly we're making our money with branding. And one of the biggest companies I work for is Adidas. It's a German company. It started about 100 years ago, but really started during the war. It was created by Adidasla, and we won the pitch with this concept that I'm going to present to you. The book is called The Story as Told by Those Who Lived and Are Living It. And the idea was really easy. So this is Adidasla himself. We had the idea to create a book that looks like taken out of a shoebox. On the introduction pages, of course, it was bringing together those two histories, the past and the future. So the past, like Beckenbauer, the future, like Leo Messi. We had pages where we had to show the beauty of those products. We had pages where we showed stars. And the idea of the book was that we sent all over the world a team of a photographer and a writer that met about 150 different former stars and football players, sport people, to make interviews, came back with tons of pictures that we put together in this book in a way that when you flip through those historical pictures, the pages were shorter and getting shorter and shorter, so that you had really this feeling of taking pictures out of a shoebox. So it was a very tactile way of discovering history, and at the same time it remembers you of yourself, how you looked at pictures a couple of years ago, before the digital age. So the difficulty in this project was really to make the choice on the pictures. We had 5,000–6,000 pictures all in all, flipping through tons of archives. It was a project that all in all took us 43 months. We showed over 101 athletes. We showed 408 products, and in the end 1,600 photographs. All in all, this book is quite heavy, with almost 650 pages. So you have to be endurant to make graphic design. This was the experience that we made last year, just before publishing this book. It was released a month ago. It's called Yearbook of Type, so we're now really touching slowly but surely into the type business. I had this idea for this book because actually there is not really a kind of encyclopedia or a book that puts together type design or contemporary type design in Latin fonts. So we had the idea to, create a kind of book bringing together all those typefaces that we like, that we think are interesting, and that had been released in the last couple of 1 or 2 years. So it was a tremendous work to get together all these fonts. So on one hand side, on the left side, you have a font template, and on the right hand side, you have a description of the font, who has been making the font, and you see samples of the font. And the big problem in producing this book was that the font samples themselves, so those on the left hand side, they were created by the designers, by the font designers, and not by us. And font designers are really bad in spelling. And font designers don't want to give you the font. So they created those pieces and sent us a PDF without the font. We designed all the book, and then we started to have the copy-proof reading. And I could tell you that almost in every of those font samples, there was a spelling mistake. I didn't notice the spelling mistakes, it was a publisher. So we thought, well, the book is done, we sent it to the publisher, and it came back with, yeah, full of little post-its saying, you have to change this page, you have to change that page. So it took us again another 2 months just to have all those corrections done. But yes, I think at the end it's a book that has a value not only for now, but maybe also for in 5 or 6 years, or in 10 years, that you take it out of the bookshelf and say, wow, those were the fonts that have been designed in the 2000s or 2010s. At the end is an index presenting all the fonts. And then a section with showing the designers, so the biographies of the designers, and a few essays and tutorials. About glyphs, about speedpunk, about typeface design at Reading. And you see Gerhard Unger here working on a workshop. Family trees and a modern interpretation of a family tree done by a German designer in Indra Kupferschmidt. So why this interest for type in my life, or how did it came? I started to make typefaces for surf companies in '94. And the first typefaces I designed was with a software called Icarus, a very strange software. It was more like a scanning software. And at the same time, it was the rise of techno music in Germany. So I was commissioned to make a lot of record covers. And in a very short time, it was like in 2 years' time, I designed over 150 fonts. All of them were headline fonts. So none of those fonts that I designed at the beginning were used for writing longer text. It was really just headline stuff. And that's why we decided to commercialize also all those fonts on the website that we named Volcano, because the company name was Magma, so it was obvious that the font company had to be named Volcano. So you see that those fonts that we present on our website are most of them headline fonts. Some of them now slowly become more and more script fonts. But it's for us really a kind of fun project and a side project, though we have a few of those fonts that are really successful and we don't know why. For example, this font here that we designed in 2003 called Fractendon. So it's a mix of a Clarendon and a Fraktur. And we're just redesigning it because it's so successful that we need to make a few corrections. Because when we created it, it was done also with Icarus, with this really terrible program, and it was super difficult to have those curves designed. So now it's more easy with glyphs to make those corrections. So this font was presented in a lot of books about typography and type design. And we come back to beer. A French label took this font to create a packaging design. Lovely. I just love this one. Those were the first catalogs that we did. It was in '96. So this kind of David Carson style. In 2001 or 2002, I designed this book with a friend of mine who's a photographer to present the font. He wanted to present his photos. I wanted to present the fonts. So we put together our money, had this book printed, and it was released by a German publisher, DGV, and sold out just in a 2-month time. So we refinanced the printing cost in a very short time. We're super enthusiastic about it, and yeah, decided to move on with creating fonts that nobody needs, as this one here, for example. This is a font to create camouflage patterns. And I had the idea to submit this camouflage pattern to the NATO. It's the organization that puts together all the armies of Europe, saying, okay, this would be really a cool camouflage for European soldiers, you know, that you could say, oh, I got hit in Italy, or I got a shot in Germany, or wherever. So I wrote them a letter and everything, but of course they didn't like the idea of this font being a camouflage font. But again, it was published in a lot of books, and or this font here, we called it Mr. Smith. It's about creating faces. So you have a font for the eyes, and you have a font for the lips, and for the head, and for the hair. And it's really easy to create really funny faces. We sent in this font for a competition done by Neville Brody, and it won the first prize of a section about security, because this font was this idea of, you know, creating phantom images of people. Another source of inspiration is traveling. So I was here a couple of years ago, was in 2005, with a few friends of mine, a photographer and illustrator, and we were on the research of visual identity and identity itself. So we first went to Mexico City, then to Los Angeles, Hong Kong, Bangkok, Dubai, and back home. In a very short time, we were traveling just 1.5 months. And in all kind of places, we met really weird people. This is a guy from Mexico City. His name is Dr. Latex. He's just making art of latex. This is, for example, a cross that he did for a church, or he has a small bag, or he makes every kind of funny sadomaso puppets, or frames to put pictures in it. He's always wearing like a huge, super big piercing on his head. So every morning he changes those piercings. And that's how he came into the book. This is another guy from Mexico City who is really into wrestling. He has one of the biggest wrestling puppets collections of the world. And I created with him this font about wrestling figures. In order to promote the font, we just had those prints cut out and stick them on posters just after the election in Karlsruhe, in the city where I'm coming from, or on any kind of other poster. So it was really fun to promote this project by that way. And out came this book. So it was a kind of graphic design experience for myself to bring together illustration, typography, and photography in a new way. I think that is something that is really common now, but in 2005, it was just the start of, you know, blending and mixing and bastarting everything. This is something that you would see now in any kind of design schools. This was Thailand. It was really weird. We had such a great time. And so it brings me to the point to say that, yeah, for me the side glance is really important, to see what is happening beside my life, beside my work. and also as a typographer, for example, to see what is happening beyond typography. So this was a book that I designed last year, where we curated all the content. It is this blend between typography being between illustration and art. So we looked for artists that are related to typography, and we looked for typographers who go into the field of art. Some of them are well known, like Edward Feller, person that I really admire for his work. Old friends, of course, like Ed Ruscha. But yeah, so it's more like a coffee table book, but for me it was really a source of great inspiration. So it was more like my personal collection of artists that I'm interested in, and then I had tons of these pictures on my computer. Then I went to the publisher and said, look, it would be interesting to have this kind of book published. And what is nice about it is not now that the museum from where I'm coming from is interested in having those artists come to the museum. So I think sometimes I work the other way around. I mean, it's not common that this is the way how a catalog is being done. It's first the curator of the exposition who has the idea to make the exposition, blah, blah, blah. So this is what the other way around. And the publisher actually is really very happy about this book. It works pretty well. But the real passion and the reason why maybe I'm here is Slanted. I started Slanted in 2004 with a blog. This was the way how this blog looked like. In 2004, there were only 100,000 blogs in Germany, so it was nothing. And just a year later, it was already over millions. When we started the blog, the first month, when we wrote a thread or when we wrote something, then we had an email written to a friend and say, hey, look, we wrote something in the blog, just have a look at it. Just to show you that at that period of time, it was really a very slow kind of communication. We recently changed the design of the blog, and somehow during all this period, I felt that this thing that is happening with design in a blog is somehow nice and interesting, but so super fast that I needed the print as a reaction, as my personal escape strategy from being a blogger. And that was the start of the Slanted magazine. So we started with Slanted magazine just 1 year after we started with the blog. And the magazine, what is nice about creating magazines, so those are spreads from different pages of the magazine. The nice thing about creating a magazine is really it's a field where you could experience things and nobody is going to kill you for it. Because a magazine is something that is not lasting. It's something that is just being there for a certain period of time and then you could throw it away. And we started having those magazines in a very small amount of copies. It was just 100 copies. The magazine was printed on digital print. This was the first issue. On the second issue already we decided that the magazine should be monothematic, so dedicated to one theme. So the first issue was about Western fonts. Then the second one about handwritten and scripts, about grid fonts, about Antiqua fonts, about ornament, about geometrics, about 2D, 3D fonts, about stencils, about heavy metal fonts. All those covers were posters at the same time that you could unfold and that you could put on the wall. This was a sentence that somebody once said about Slanted, that it's porn for type lovers. So when we hear this sentence, we just picked up this quote and made 4 covers of it. So the geometrics, the 42D, the stencil, and the heavy metal. And then came, after the 11th issue, a new concept. So it was more about having the content printed on the cover, something that you see or that we saw then really popping up everywhere, this idea of saying on the cover already what is inside. Grotesque, experimental fonts, bold and light fonts. To promote Slanted, all of them or most of them had small trailers. I'm going to show you this trailer about light and bold. So I'm going to, on 2 issues, on 3 issues, give you a deeper insight of what it is about exactly. For example, here on the 17th issue about comic fonts, the concept is that I believe that the way how magazines are designed nowadays is always the same, and we want to break with it. The way how magazines today are designed is, or most of them, is introduction, content, first story, second story, third story, bits, advertising, bits, index, and that's it. And we felt somehow that magazines could be told in a story more like a movie, like a film, like something that has cuts, that has association. And what for me in graphic design is really nice and what I really like is to give content just by putting together things in a new way or mixing things up in a new way so that the new content is there. This is, for example, what happens on this page here. It's a photographer from Tokyo, Patrick Tsai, and a beautiful piece of artwork from Fail. And we just brought those 2 pictures together, and suddenly, because this double spread is there, it tells a story. You don't know really what is happening between this guy and this woman. Is there a relationship going on, or what happened? On the following pages, we had this image here. So it's still Patrick Tsai on the right-hand side. It's a great photographer. It's him here with his cat. And he loves to tell stories with animals. And the way he photographs, for example, is also this kind of storytelling. On the right-hand side, it's just a story with 2 images. It's the cat who plays with the mouse. The mouse is dead. He takes chopsticks, put the mouse in the piece of paper and throws it in the trash can, and that's it. So it's just a small story told in 2 images. I just love that kind of stuff. So how did I proceed on this? It was taking all the comic fonts that we were presenting in the magazine and displaying them as the legends of the imagery. So usually you would have the title of the image in very small, like 12-point typeface underneath the image, and here we went the other way around. It was displaying it in a very big way, going over the images or over the pictures itself and making really a comic cover of it. This section, you have seen it now in the typo lyrics, in the typo books, in typo lyrics. So it's the same story. we love this kind of displaying fonts. So we invite typographers to present their fonts by telling them, okay, we want you to design a kind of piece of showing the beauty of your font. And here the briefing was really easy. We said you're only allowed to use words that are coming out of comics, like boom, kaboom, chak, clack, bang, you know, all those kind of bubbles and stuff. So this brought all those font samples together in the magazine. And at the same time, I'm working together on most of the issues with Corbis from New York. And Ken Johnson is the chief of the Corbis image archive. It's one of the biggest archives that had been built up after or during the Second World War by a German, a Jewish person who came to New York with a huge archive of images and saw the value of having behind the images those information about the image. So this here, you don't see it here on display, but what is really interesting is that at that time, reportage photography worked in a way that the photographer went to a spot, took a photo, went to his hotel, had the film developed, took his writing machine, and wrote, it happened here, blah, 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 and stick them on the back of the photo. And at this archive, and it was in the 40s and 50s, they already knew this is really a great value to have this information stick to the photo and not throw it away. So all of this thing that happens now in the internet of those images where you just have to, you know, put a word in and you find the image, it comes from this here. And this is a story about a town in Nevada. It's called Doomtown. And Ken Johnson put together all those images for me. It happened in 53 and 54. And the US Army had this place bomb tests for nuclear weapons. So they built up a house. You see the house here. And then soldiers came and installed in the house puppets. And they arranged real life situations. And then the bomb just exploded. And what happens when a nuclear bomb explodes, it is that the heat is faster than the pressure. So what comes is first the heat that destroys everything and burns everything, and then comes the pressure that destroys the rest. So what you see here on the lower picture, it is the heat that hits the window. And people were just standing away, not that far. It's just 100 miles. At some places, maybe 90 miles at others. And here you see how the house is, here you see how the house is still there. Then this is the heat here, followed by the pressure in the final explosion. And I thought it would be really a nice double page, somehow nice but horrible at the same time, to have those fun specimens together with those images. Then the technical staff came and made analysis of the puppets and the dummies. And if you know the band Kraftwerk, a German band, they were really inspired by those kind of test dummies. Some of the people at that time really went to those sites to take pictures of themselves, as here a dancer who was just getting there to have this picture shot in front of the explosion of the H-bomb here. This is the sky over Las Vegas at 3 o'clock in the morning, and it was just bright because of the light of the bomb. Kaboom. Followed signage, followed by super families. I'm going to show you a few pictures of this magazine here. So it was about, we released it last year, about super family fonts. And here we started this issue with pictures of all kinds of families from around the world. This is a Mexican family that lives, half of them in Mexico, the other half in the United States. And the idea of this design was again to have something more like in a movie, so with pictures laying over each other. So it is this relation about design, telling stories, trying to express things in a way that is more coming out from other influences than just graphic design that I'm interested in. This here is a beautiful story about a father who took pictures for 30 years of his daughter every day, once a year at the same time on the same day. So it's not her birthday, but it's one day in the year where he meets her and takes those pictures. And they're really heart-touching for me. Because you see how this girl is growing up and goes through all the difficulties of life and breaks up with her friend and comes together with a new one and so on. Here again, the idea was to work with Corbis on images from royals. So we got, again, this putting together of font samples and royals from all over the world. And I was super proud about this one here with Diana and Charles. It's nice to be a publisher of a graphic design magazine and be able to publish such kind of picture. Typo lyrics, we're going to go in that later. And that's it. Slab serif, actually I saw it here in the library. And the Cuban issue is the last one I'm going to present. It was just released at the beginning of this year, and unfortunately it's sold out. We sold 10,000 copies. We were really super surprised. It happened that I went to Cuba last year. This is Havana, the capital of Cuba. This is from where I took the picture. Cuba has been built more or less in the 50s, late 50s by the Americans, and since then nothing had been changed. All of the buildings are, or most of the buildings are from that period of time. There's no more water, canalization. This is, everything is really in a very bad shape. This is the image that we have of Cuba beside this romantic aspect of old things we have this image in mind of beautiful girls on the beach. We go there to see those kind of wall paintings. Of course, there's this revolution thing going on in mind of Fidel Castro and Che Guevara. Hemingway had been living there, so you find on tourist market books about Hemingway. This is the way how, you have all kind of beautiful old cars. Quite similar to the tuk-tuk. Or even this one. Or even this kind of way for locomotion. I was there and met those two designers, and they introduced me to all kind of places where you could see something that is really amazing in Cuba. It's posters. Poster design has a huge tradition in Cuba, and it came from the fact that in the 50s, when the Americans went to Cuba, they had also all the advertising industry going there. And Cuba was somehow the test market for South America. So all the big brands first tested the products in Havana or in Cuba before going to Brazil. Then came the revolution, And Fidel Castro said, hey, we're going to stop with all this imperialism stuff. So the graphic designers started to make posters either for the revolution cause or for cultural cause. So they started to make tons and tons and tons of posters for cinema and for movies. And all of them are made on silkscreen, 100 copies. They don't have film, so all is cut out by hand. It's really amazing work. They don't have color, so they have to mix all the colors. Sometimes they mix it with blood and stuff like that. So it's really super experimental in the way how they print. But they are super proud of those posters. Every printer keeps a certain amount of posters to resell them. It's a real value. It's kind of exchange. People make money of it. So it was a great experience first to go there and collect quite a lot of posters. Some of them are really funny, like here, this one, the red one. If you look at the spelling, Tom Cruise, Julia Roberts. And then we came back with a lot of files. I took a lot of pictures. I bought a few of them. And the question was, what am I going to do? Fortunately, I met a gallerist in Cuba who introduced me to a bunch of photographers. One of them is Michel Pou. He took this photo in '96. So this is the way how Cubans escaped Cuba, by building those kind of rafts and hoping that the wind and current is going to carry them to the other side of the ocean, to Florida. It's 100 miles away. And at that time, the sharks really came close to the coast just because there were so many people dying there. So American Coast Guard just cruised around, picked up the people, brought them to the United States, and those boats were, by the wind, brought back to the coast of Cuba. And other people jumped on and went away. So there were boats like where people 4 or 5 times could use the same boat to escape Cuba. And I discovered a lot of things that I didn't know. For example, that bodybuilding is a huge issue in Cuba. Those are beautiful pictures of Aryan Chan, a photographer from Cuba. And he never studied photography. He's only a small Olympus OM1 camera, analog camera. And I think those images are just brilliant. It's a very young guy. He's 22 years old. And the way how they build up their muscles is by injecting peanut oil. And some of them die of it, of course. This is one of the most famous photographers from Cuba, Alejandro Gonzalez. And he wanted me to publish those images, but I thought that they were too glossy. And he had another series. Those were the one that we published, of young kids, Cuban kids. And it shows that they're just the same as we are. So that was, again, for me, a big surprise. All those pictures had been taken on the Malecom. It's the main avenue on the seaside, where people in the evening meet to party, to get drunk, to hang around. And after this project, he went to the countryside and started to make pictures of young Cuban kids in their homes, with all their desires and hopes for the future. But at the same time, I think all of them really look super proud and really nice and hopeful for a better future. This is the way how a lot of people live there. And this is the home of his mother. This is where he grew up, and now he's a photographer. This is his mother. So she's a farmer. And he started to make pictures of farmers all over the country. And again, I just love these pictures because farmers, they look so proud. And I mean, those could be images of Hollywood stars. Just look how they stand there. It's, yeah, beautiful. There are no maps in Cuba, no cards, no information about history, nothing. And again, I worked here with Corbis to present pictures of Guantanamo. And Corbis had no pictures of Guantanamo that they were allowed to publish in the magazine. Really strange. So it took us quite a long time until we find an American photographer, Edmund Clark, who was a former member of the army and who secretly took those kind of pictures. This is a view of McDonald's in Cuba. And you have to know that there's an embargo between America and Cuba. And you have Ronald McDonald just in front of the McDonald's. This is the way how it looks there. This is the prison of Guantanamo. Those are the suits of the soldiers. This is one of the places where people could play football. Now I'm showing a film that explains how the magazine was produced. How it looked out, or how it looked when it came out of the printer. So the cover was a piece of artwork from Eduardo, a Cuban, who took the Cuban flag. He just cut the star, and the star was swinging away like the boats that or like the people on the raft that I showed you at the very beginning of the lecture. I have a brief insight. You know those pictures already. This is how they were presented in the magazine. So we first printed the first part on a very rough, dark paper, like Cuban paper. Then it came to those pictures here. So it was first bring the reader into what is Cuba, how does it look like, how do the people look like. Then it started to mix those images with posters. And then we went into about 100 pages presenting Cuban posters. And the posters not put together in a historical way, but more in a thematic way. So posters about faces, about shapes. I love this one here. If you skip the page, it's the same poster, but the boat is turning around. Some of the posters, of course, have never been published. Some of them have, of course, been published in quite a lot of other magazines. Mariscal, a designer from Barcelona, made a beautiful film, Rica and Chico, that we presented. A lot of text, illustration, and this is a new thing that we started is this to embed reality in the magazines. How? I'm going to show it on this sample here. This is a piece of artwork that I really love. It is, the photographer found out that Fidel Castro, during the revolution, all the pictures that you find in history books are not true. All of them are false. That the pictures had been made 1 year after the revolution. So a photographer came, said, Fidel Castro, come on. Che Guevara, come on. We need to go again in the jungle, and we need to make again photos, because those of the revolution are not strong enough. So what this artist did, he recreated those images. So this is the original one of Fidel Castro, but it's not the original one. It's the so sad original one. And he went with a friend of him and took this picture. This is Che Guevara. And he took this one. It's Fidel Castro in the jungle. He made this one here. Or it's a revolution image, one of the most iconic images, but again, it's a fake image. And he created this one here. And the way how it's presented in the magazine now, that you could download an application. And with this application, when you have it on your iPhone, you could go over the pages of the magazine, and the content is delivered just underneath the where your iPhone is going to be. So you see here was first the QR code, and now you go over the image and it just changes. And as soon as you go with the iPhone out of the page again and flip to another page, a new content is loaded. So I think it's a super possibility to bring together kind of interactive content together with printed content. Of course, typefaces from Cuba, a very few of them, but really nice ones. Most of them produced by people living in exile, like T26 Carlos. And again, the designers, back cover and cover, and a sort of small insert about the most interesting typefaces of today. The interesting thing is, when we published the magazine, we sold the magazine on all kind of websites, and PayPal, we checked our payments on PayPal, and for a month no payment arrived. And we were just wondering, because usually it's PayPal that sells quite a lot, or a lot of income comes from PayPal. And we found out that PayPal is censoring any kind of publication containing the name Cuba, because PayPal is an American company. So there's still this embargo, so it's really amazing. So we had to change the title in the PayPal account. Really weird. Then we created a website showing all the posters. So it's now one of the biggest contemporary collection of Cuban posters. So if you're interested in seeing those posters, it's just slanted/Cuba. The magazine went to Cuba, was distributed to all the designers, all the people we met there. There was a big release party in a theater, a huge tombola, and a lot of really proud people just loving the work we did. I'm going to finish my lecture with typolyrics. Takes us 5 minutes, and then we're done. This book, Typolyrics, puts together hundreds of typolyrics that designers created over the last years. Again, this trick was really a nice one. Just have a one color print and change of colors of the paper. And the book is divided in 11 sections. The idea of typolyrics is a very simple one. Is we give an MP3 file to an artist, and we deliver the font, and we ask the artist to create a piece using the lyrics, knowing the music, and taking the typeface itself. And this book here was divided in 11 sections. Each section was dedicated to one of the type categories. So for example, heavy metal music was dedicated to heavy metal fonts or broken fonts, or pop music was dedicated to grotesque fonts. And the nice thing about this kind of work is it's again in between everything. It's in between typography, type design, illustration. And for us it was really super nice to discover what is happening, how do people interpret, or what kind of interpretation do they have of this kind of thing. Because there is a strong relationship between music and typography. I mean, all of us, we hear music. All of us, we are with our computers, hanging around, working, having music because it's too loud in the surrounding of the office. And there's a real connection between those two. And we invited typographers from Thailand to create typolyrics. We need sound, a lot of sound, please. And those were the results. Why, where's the sound? Sound, please? No? Do we have sound on a computer, please? Because I need sound to show you the typolyrics in Thailand. Yeah. Sound up, please. So I have to say thank you to my team in Karlsruhe, and thank you to you for your patience. Thank you.
ครับ
So you're invited, of course, to come to Brown Sugar to the exposition of typolyrics. We had a workshop here, and it was really a great team of people working on this workshop as well. A lot of students from here and artists from here. It was just beautiful, and I'm excited to open the exposition in 2 days. Thank you.
Also, we have a wrapping up party on Saturday, tomorrow at Brown Sugar as well. Thank you. Q&A, any question, please? มาดูแล้วอยากทำหนังสือบ้างเนาะครับ พรุ่งนี้มีอีกวันนึงครับสำหรับทุกท่านที่จะจำได้ว่าตอนประมาณปี 2002 มันมีข่าวอันหนึ่งซึ่งเป็นข่าวเกี่ยวกับไทโปกราฟีนะฮะที่น่าจะใหญ่ที่สุดในประวัติศาสตร์ชาติไทยคือตอนนั้นมีบริษัทฟอนต์ทำเรื่องฟ้องร้องบริษัทต่างๆที่ไม่ยอมซื้อฟอนต์ตามลิขสิทธิ์แต่ว่าเนื่องจากตอนนั้นความเข้าใจเรื่องการออกแบบตัวอักษรของคนไทยยังคงไม่แตกฉานนะฮะก็เลยสื่อก็เลยตีความว่ามีคนพยายามที่จะเรียกร้องลิขสิทธิ์จากภาษาไทยคือภาษาไทยกับ ที่เราใช้กันแต่จริงๆแล้วมันเป็นเรื่องของการดีไซน์ตัวหนังสือภาษาไทยนะครับผมคิดว่าการที่เรามาที่นี่เราคงแบบว่าทุกคนที่คงเข้าใจเรื่องความสำคัญของการออกแบบตัวอักษรแล้วอย่างวันนี้เนี่ยเราเห็นว่าความสำคัญของมันไม่ใช่แค่หน้าตาเท่านั้นมันมีทั้งการรีเสิร์ชมีอารมณ์มีเหตุผลมีตรรกะต่างๆเบื้องลึกที่ไม่สามารถมองได้ด้วยตานะครับอยู่เบื้องหลังนะครับก็คือจริงๆแล้วอย่างที่ทุกคนเข้าใจที่นี่คือว่าตัวอักษรเป็นสื่อมีเดียมในการสื่อสารที่สำคัญที่สุดนะครับโลกเราที่วุ่นวายหรือดีได้ปัจจุบันนี้ก็เกิดจากการสื่อสารนะครับดังนั้นพรุ่งนี้มีอีกวันหนึ่งนะครับที่จุฬาแต่ว่าลักษณะของพรุ่งนี้จะเป็นการซิมโพเซียมคือสามารถถามตอบออกความเห็นได้ตลอดเวลานะครับวิทยากร6ท่านเริ่ม 10 โมงครึ่งนะครับ10 โมงใช่ไหมฮะ10 โมงนะครับอีกทีหนึ่งหนาวเหมือนกันถ้าเกิดจะไปก็เตรียมเสื้อไปห่มนะครับและ We would like to thank you Lars very much. You want to give me a hug? Got a t-shirt. I don't know if it's your size.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And I would like to invite Mr. Boris to come up, please.
Thank you very much. I think after this long day, I haven't a lot of to say because probably after the lunch coma, we have now the lecture coma. We're going a long way today from reading to writing to designing, and I think we had seen a lot of different aspects of these themes. The only thing I want to say, thank you to you that you attend such a long time, that you are so strong to be here, and who had not picked up the bag with this small brochure, please do it now, because this is the documentation about the typeface typolyrics project that Lars had presented at this moment. And I have to say thank you, and probably I'm hopeful you will be attend tomorrow again at Chulalongkorn. Thank you very much.
ครับขอบคุณครับพรุ่งนี้เจอกันแล้วก็นะฮะมีปาร์ตี้ตอนจบพรุ่งนี้ที่บาชูก้านะครับส่วนคืนนี้นะครับมีปาร์ตี้ที่โซนิกนะครับหนังสือทูแมกกาซีนได้ยินว่าเล่าฟรีนะครับถ้าเกิดสนใจก็ไปกันได้จริงๆผมเป็น MC ให้อีกวันหนึ่งพรุ่งนี้ก็เจอกันอีกนะครับถ้าเกิดไม่พอใจก็ทนหน่อยแล้วกันนะครับไม่พอใจมากๆก็เขียนในกระดาษในพันทิปได้ขอบคุณครับ